button and then we'll be live. So here we go. All right, we are live. Joining me today, an extra special guest, François Kammerer. I'm sorry for that American pronunciation of your name, but François, for people who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so let's start with the hard questions. So my name is François Kammerer, and I'm fine with tons of different pronunciations. And so I am originally French philosopher of mind, and now active in Germany. I'm a postdoc at the university in Bochum in the team of Tobias Schlicht. And I got my PhD a few years ago from the Université Paris-Sorbonne, so in Paris. And so I've been working mainly on consciousness. And so I think, of course, we're going to talk a lot about that. So one of the things that I've been doing in the recent years at the end of my PhD and now is develop and defend and explore an illusionist conception of phenomenal consciousness. So to take the label offered by Keith Frankish. But I think we are going to talk about that more in details. So I don't know if there are more things to say about me in the first place. Except that one thing that might be relevant to some of the work is that so I've been trained in philosophy, but I've not been interested in analytic philosophy until rather late compared to most people that I meet in most professional settings, which is that I did not really get into analytical philosophy before the second year of master's. So I was trained in France rather traditionally, doing history of philosophy and loads of French philosophy, and I actually like that. So I'm not the kind of person who would say analytic philosophy rules and continental philosophy is just awful. Actually, I kind of like that. So I changed my mind about lots of things, and I also changed a lot of my philosophical interests. But so yeah, I went rather late to analytical philosophy, and I went to it mainly because I thought, okay, that's where you can really tackle the problem of consciousness, because I was really interested in the problem of consciousness. And so I've been staying quite a lot of years working on this problem of phenomenal consciousness.
Oh, that's interesting. So I didn't realize that you had the background in continental philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, I also had an interest in, as an undergraduate, early graduate, I was very interested in Sartre and not so much I liked arguing against Derrida, but I was interested in that sort of stuff, Foucault and so. So that's where you find a lot of really interesting questions being discussed. I've never really got this continental analytic divide, to be honest with you. It's like everyone's interested in these questions and they just have different approaches, and I don't see what the fuss. So
my own opinion, but we can discuss that later because maybe less central to consciousness life is that, so first of all, continental is some sort of, it's not a real category because it mixes together lots of different things. Some of it really good, some of it really bad, some of it, etc. And yeah, I don't know what to make of the distinction myself and how to position myself. Clearly, what I'm doing now is analytic philosophy, but I think it would be wrong to have too narrow a conception of what it should be, and also to consider that whatever is not labeled analytic philosophy is just not interesting. But anyway, we could discuss that maybe.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree with you 100%. I'm not into boundary policing in terms of like what is and isn't good philosophy. I think it's we should have open borders here. But so that's interesting. I know your early work too, you were sort of before, I mean, not early, but I mean, your early published work, I guess, was sort of focused on questions about group consciousness. Because I read a paper of yours actually defending an anti-nesting principle.
Yeah, I did that actually. Yeah. So if you want the story, I did not really work on that. It's just that I was an avid reader of Eric Schwitzgebel's blog. I don't know if you read this blog, like the Splinter. I think it's a really good blog, and I think Eric does a really great job at doing blogging and philosophy in some sort of productive and fruitful manner. And I just read this article that Eric had written about. If you're a materialist, then you should probably accept that the US as a whole is conscious. And I thought, no, that's wrong. There are lots of answers. And I blogged the answer. And then he told me, you should publish that. So, okay, I'm going to publish that. And so it was rather peripheral. I was not really working on that. It's just Eric telling me, that's publishable. I said, okay, I'm going to publish that then.
Okay, well, that's good feedback. I really enjoy Eric's blog, by the way, and he inspired me to, amongst other people, to start blogging back in the day. I sort of feel like it's too bad that philosophy blogging isn't what it used to be. It used to be like a big community, actually. Yeah, now there's only a few of the bigger names, which is too bad because, like you say, blogging is a really good way to get your ideas out, to get people reading them, and sometimes it's a pipeline to get things published. So I think it's an alternative, nice way of thinking.
But yeah, to go back to this paper that I published, so I think it was a time where I was not clearly an eliminativist / illusionist about consciousness. So I still wanted more or less to be realist. And so I was still interested in knowing, but is the United States really conscious, really phenomenally conscious or not? And of course I wanted to say no, because it's really weird. And then shortly after that, I mean, that around the time the paper was published, I was starting to say, no, but actually I'm going to go illusionist. That's the thing, that's the way I make sense of things. And so in some sense now, this problem of nested consciousness, I mean, I still find them interesting as a puzzle, like intellectual puzzle, but I don't find them as pressing as maybe I used to 5 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting that you phrase it that way. So I am curious, like what sort of, the way you describe it is sort of like a conversion from, realism about consciousness to illusionism. So before I ask you like what your version, and I also want you to distinguish between illusionism and limitativism, which you do in some of your work, which I think is a nice distinction that's needed. But anyway, so I'm just curious, like what sort of led you towards the illusionist side of things?
Oh, so I would describe things that way. First, I was, when I started doing some philosophy at the end of high school as an undergrad, and as an undergrad, then I think I wanted to be a materialist, right? Because materialism sounded more serious, more scientific. And also I was kind of reading lots of left-wing authors like Marx and Foucault. And I thought, okay, also, if you want to be really left-wing, you also have to be a materialist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I really wanted to be a materialist, but it never occurred to me that phenomenal consciousness, specifically like this subjective experiential aspect of mental life, could create a specific problem for materialism. So I was more focused on, yes, the ones who are not materialists are the religious ones who think that there is a soul that survived, and this is wrong, there is no such thing, right? And then I remember as an undergrad thinking a little bit to myself, but that's weird, this materialism, because what do you do of this like subjective aspect of everything, right? There is a body, but it feels like something from the inside. And I said, okay, I guess that you have to admit that matter has some sort of internal side, right? And I was happy with that. I didn't see it as a problem for materialism. And then later, when I got into analytical philosophy, I started reading, for example, like Chalmers and Levine. And I'm like, no, wait, this is a problem for materialism, because what you thought was materialist is in fact more some sort of property dualism. So what I was calling myself a materialist, but in fact, really, I was more of a property dualist, thinking, well, there is objective matter, and then from the inside, it feels like something, but this feeling, of course, cannot be exactly the same kind of aspect as the objective external aspects, right? And then I was torn, and then I read Levine, I read The Conscious Mind by Dave Chalmers, and at some point, I flirted a little bit with property dualism, like properly
naturalistic dualism.
Naturalistic dualism or some sort of monism. And I must say, what convinced me that it had to be wrong was the very cool and chapter on phenomenal judgment by Chalmers, right? I think it must be chapter 5 of The Conscious Mind.
Yeah, the paradox of phenomenal judgment.
Yeah, like the idea that if you have this like a naturalistic dualism that has to be either epiphenomenalist or something close to epiphenomenalism in some sense, then you don't understand what role does this conscious experience play in our phenomenal judgment. Because we say that we're phenomenally conscious, we think about it, and if phenomenal consciousness is this epiphenomenal thing, then what role does it play? And if you're Russian and monist and you say, no, actually it plays a role because it grounds it's a categorical basis of whatever calls a judgment, still it feels like it could be another phenomenal experience if it could change nothing as long as the same dispositions are grounded. And then it felt just weird. I felt, okay, it can't be true. Materialism in some sense, like the stricter materialism has to be true, because otherwise it's so weird, because we have this sort of material, we have all this sort of material phenomenon, such as our judgments about consciousness that seem to be related so closely to phenomenal consciousness. And I could not make sense of that in a satisfying manner in whatever non-materialist framework was offered. And then I thought, okay, I have to be a materialist. And then roughly I thought, okay, the best strategy to be a materialist, the one that is super popular, everyone is after, is type B physicalism, that you complement with some sort of phenomenal concept theory that to explain, okay, materialism is true, but still it kind of seems false, and we have to explain that. And so I did my PhD mainly on that. I reviewed various series focusing on Brian Law and David Papineau and a few others. And I got out of this thinking, no, it doesn't work. What does not work is that none of these theories seemed able to me to capture what I think Joe Levine called the substantive and determinate grasp of consciousness that we have through introspection, right? All these views seem to fail for some reason. And they also did not seem able for me to account for our persistent and strong anti-physicalist intuitions. Because if really I grasp my phenomenal states via some sort of empty demonstrative, then why should I be so reluctant to accept that this is in fact a brain state? Right. If I have no grasp of what this is, right? It's just some sort of empty label, and then I should be able to identify it with anything. And still I'm resistant to do that. And then I thought, okay, so to account for our anti-physicalist intuitions, we have to admit that our grasp of consciousness is substantive, that we grasp something of what consciousness is. But once you go that way, then you're very soon led to admit, wait, but if we have a certain grasp of what consciousness is, if this grasp makes physicalism problematic, if it creates anti-physicalist intuitions, and yet I'm a physicalist, then the only natural answer is that, well, there is nothing that satisfies this grasp. This grasp has to be illusory, right? Nothing fits the representation. And that's how slowly I started to accept, yeah, so this thing cannot exist in some sense. At least there is a way of, I mean, because we can discuss about that later when we debate, I suppose, about weak illusionism and that kind of stuff. Right. Like there is a sense in which this thing that I grasp through introspection is not real. And then I turned illusionist. And then, so end of the story, because I did not have the label. And then I was like writing about that. And I sent some of the things I was writing to Dave Chalmers, say, okay, I have this view. And he said, oh, yeah, that sounds cool. You should read this draft by a guy called Keith Frankish. He calls that Illusionism. And I think you will like that. And I read it and said, no, that's great. That's exactly what we should do. Just better written, of course, and much more structured and much better. But that's what I think. And so since that day, I've endorsed Keith's great label, Illusionism.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The story of my conversion.
Yeah, I like it. That's a very nice story. Because one of the things that kind of jumps out, I mean, one of the things that I think that I like about your work and your approach in particular is that you started off as a phenomenal realist, like you just described. Yes. And so part of your view is struggling with this idea that we introspectively have a grasp on something, but then for theoretical reasons, we become convinced, or some people can become convinced that this thing that we thought we had a grasp on isn't really there. And that's why I think you really have put your finger on the big problem for illusionism, which is what you call the illusion meta problem. But before we get to, I want to talk about that, but before we get to that, I am curious why you don't, so I guess it's hard to phrase the question, but I guess what I'm wondering is why you didn't end up a dualist, given what you just told us. Because if you really feel like you're confronted with something in your experience that you can't make a sense of physically or in physicalistic terms, then I wonder, you said you sort of briefly flirted with property dualism, but I wonder what was dissatisfying. And I'm not a dualist. I mean, I'm friendly to physicalists, so I'm not trying to press you in that direction, but I am just curious, like, when you're at that crossroads and you're like thinking to yourself, okay, so it's either this thing is real and it has these properties that are, in my opinion, in opposition to physicalism, or I'm mistaken about the properties it has. What kind of led you in one direction versus the other?
That's a very good question. So I would say that's one thing that I was quite convinced in the first place. I'm still quite convinced by it. And it's not that physicalism is true, but it's something like, yeah, I guess that probably we should be able to explain everything about our behavior in physicalist term. So a physicalist term, by that, of course, I mean with the usual caveat, so something like physical, functional, and I'm not saying anything about the intrinsic nature of the physical, and it might be that we ignore lots of things, but I know that at least it's not fundamentally mental, right? So I accept the via negativa approach of Montero and Papineau. Right. Anyway, so now I would just use physical to mean all of that. So I was quite convinced, I'm still quite convinced that, yeah, we should be able to explain at least all of our behaviors without appealing to anything that is not physical. Right. So I was not convinced that physicalism is true, but I was convinced that to explain behavior, like things that we say, things that we do with our bodies, we should not have to appeal to anything else than physical stuff. That's something I was convinced by. But then, of course, at some point I was ready to think, okay, but maybe there are other things in the universe, right? Why would it be? Of course, you can explain all behavior just in physical terms, but there might be other things on top of that. But then at some point I had this problem, which is that how do I know that I'm phenomenally conscious? How do I think I know I'm phenomenally conscious? Well, I think about it, and this thinking leads immediately to behavior, right? Such as speaking, writing certain things. Right. And of course, on a certain level, like my brain does things when I introspect, right? And that's where the paradox, like Chalmers' paradox of phenomenal judgment kicks in, which is that, wait, if I'm a dualist, that means that there is stuff that is non-physical, right? That constitute my phenomenal consciousness. At the same time, I really want to admit that my phenomenal consciousness is relevant, importantly relevant for my phenomenal judgments. Mm-hmm. And yet I also think that there is a level at which my phenomenal judgment can be explained without appealing to anything non-physical. And that's a real problem. And of course, Chalmers struggles with this problem, and he gives an answer that I must say is one part of the book where I thought, no, I really, because he's great at arguing, right? It's great. He's like, no, that I cannot believe. This is verbal. This is, at least for me, right? I felt it was a verbal answer, not satisfied. And so if I had to be a dualist, I would say, okay, maybe some sort of interactionist dualist, maybe that would seem coherent, because then if your interaction is dualist, and you can explain how this non-physical stuff is really relevant for your behavior of talking about your phenomenal consciousness. Right. But then I had this prior commitment that, no, you should be able to explain all about behavior just in physical functional terms. So interactionist dualist was for me not 100% ruled out, but at least very seriously, like I would just give very marginal credence to it. Mm-hmm. Because I have the impression, maybe I'm wrong, but I have the impression that interactionist dualist is just not really an option given what we know about like what contemporary neuroscience tells us. There does not seem to be this like causal gaps that needs to be filled by something non-physical. So anyway, so that was the landscape. I could not accept non-interactionist dualism because it just seemed to have weird consequences for phenomenal judgment, and at the same time, interactionist dualism seemed to me to be ruled out. So that would be why dualism or other kind of anti-physicalisms that make consciousness fundamental were for me sort of ruled out.
Okay, interesting.
So if you want to know what for me are still the contenders, of course are still contenders, I still think that maybe some sort of idealism makes sense on some level. There is still some sort of problem of phenomenal judgment that still exists, but I don't know. I'm not saying these theories are not coherent, right? I'm just saying there are lots of important problems that arises for them.
Right. But so you don't, so I think that's interesting that you put it that way. So you think that idealism is a contender, but not realism, physical realism. Because I honestly, like, I don't really share the intuition that this thing called consciousness couldn't be physical. So I always find it, to me, I find it very, I don't know, it's hard for me to put myself in the position as someone who takes that kind of view so seriously that they're willing to go and explore these other sorts of ideas, because I just think, well, the most plausible thing is that it's something in the brain. And yeah, conceptually, it's a bit hard, I guess, for some people to make sense of that, but why do we expect things to conceptually make sense to us is a puzzle to me. I guess I just, So anyway, I'm not saying that's an argument or anything against your view. It's just, I'm always curious about why people take the other view.
So I think one way to make sense of maybe our different ways of approaching it would be to say, well, maybe we're using the word consciousness differently, right? And that would be some sort of verbal issue. And I think that maybe in some cases, opposition between, let's say, weak illusionism and strong illusionism really comes down to a verbal issue. For example, maybe what you're saying is that, well, the way you would use consciousness refers to whatever the real thing that tends to cause your judgment that you are phenomenally conscious, or tends to cause your introspective representation of phenomenal consciousness. And that's a fine way to use the word consciousness. And I agree that if you use the word, like we talk about phenomenal consciousness, right? That's the way you define phenomenal consciousness, then I agree that, probably phenomenal consciousness is something. I don't know, it might be a very disjunctive property, like it might correspond to a very disjunctive property of the brain, maybe not very interesting scientifically, but it certainly is something. There's probably something that tends to reliably cause my representation of my phenomenal states. But
those are quasi-phenomenal properties, what you're talking about in the technical language, like that Frankish introduces, right?
Sorry, excuse me?
I said those would be quasi-phenomenal properties in the language that Frankish introduces.
So from my perspective, what I would say, listen, what I suggest is to use the word phenomenal consciousness, not to refer to whatever causes our representation of phenomenal states, but I rather consider that in phenomenal introspection, I have some sort of grasp of something, right? I have a grasp of something that I think is a state I'm in, like this experience of a red notebook. Of course, I took a red object to have next to me. Like this, the redness of my experience, I feel like I grasp.
Philosophers and their props.
Exactly. If you don't have a red object, then how do you do? I feel like I have a grasp of what it is, right? What it's like to see red. And when I talk about phenomenal consciousness, I talk about that, not whatever causes me having this representation or me being tempted to say that I have this state, but this state that I grasp through introspection, and that what I want to know exists or not and what it is. And of this, if you tell me that this can unproblematically be identified with a brain state, then I'm very puzzled. And to me, someone tells me that, I feel so. I feel exactly as if I've had a Catholic upbringing, right? For me, it's exactly as if someone tells me, God is both 1 and 3.
Yeah.
Or this piece of bread is also really literally the body of Christ. And I'm like, I suppose that I can say these words. I can, will try myself to accept this word, but in the end, I don't understand what it means. It's a mystery. Yeah. And the Catholic Church says, yes, these are literally mysteries. And to me, when someone asks me to accept that this thing that I grasp through introspection, not whatever causes it, right? But this thing is just brain state or whatever other physical functional state, just exactly the same thing. I just don't understand. I cannot really contemplate it really.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I have the opposite view. To me, so I have the same reaction to the illusionist. So we'll get to that, but it's like, that's the meta problem that we're going to talk about. But to me, it's like you're asking me to think this thing, which I know is right in front of me, is like an illusion. And I don't really get that. But at the same time, so one way to work your way into sort of my view, because my view is just what you said. I think phenomenal consciousness is what it's like to, it has subjectivity and all these things. You can build as much into you want. I still don't think it's a problem that it's physical. I mean, you could take like the way David Chalmers thinks about it, and I say that could be physical. And one piece of evidence that I think about this is conceivability. So it's certainly conceivable that that is simply a physical thing in my brain. And so there's no a priori contradiction in it. There's nothing that no one, if there were, someone would have published it and become very famous by now. So lots of people have thought about this for a long time. There's certainly, if there is a contradiction there, you have to dig very deep for it. So it just seems to me like this sense of puzzlement that people have, which you're espousing, isn't really based in what we normally take puzzle, because the Trinity thing is different. That's a contradiction. 1 is not 3. So there's the contradiction. But there's nothing like that with respect to saying this experience of red is a physical brain state. So I don't know what the source of puzzlement really would be.
Okay, that's great question. So I want to say 2 things. First, I will not answer your question, and then I will try to answer. The first thing I want to do, not answering your question, but I will just want to raise some sort of worry linked to what you just said earlier. You said earlier, okay, you think that physicalist realist, I say physicalist realist is really like a mystery of the Catholic Church, and you feel the same way about illusionism. I cannot accept that this does not exist. And then I just want to raise a little worry, which are for all weak illusionists out there, which is the following. I think that there is some sort of tension between having this strong confidence that this has to be real. This is the one thing that I cannot deny in my theories in the first place. And then in the second place, ending up developing a theory of what this is that makes it a perfectly mundane thing that in the end could very well have been misrepresented and could in fact very well not exist. You see what I mean? What I mean is that I'm always a bit puzzled when I see weak illusionists saying, I cannot accept strong illusionism because of course I know this is real, this is undeniable. Because to me, to really back up their high confidence, it seems to me that they have to appeal in some sense to the kind of epistemology that only the realist can appeal, like only the strong realist who thinks that, we have some sort of special epistemic relation to consciousness and not just a physical mechanism of detection, right? So that's just a worry, general worries that are for weak illusionists. I think that there is a tension between 2 things. So one thing is that they don't want to abandon phenomenal consciousness at all costs. And second, what they say about phenomenal consciousness makes it so that it is considered as a thing that they should very well be able, maybe not to abandon, but at least to consider maybe does not exist.
Yeah,
okay.
I guess, yeah. So I'm less puzzled by that because I don't really see how it's a serious possibility that it couldn't exist. So it doesn't seem to me to be the sort of thing. I mean, I'm not really into certainty, and I don't really care about epistemology all that much, to be honest. But it seems to me like if there were something I was certain of, it's this, that I'm conscious in the sense, I could be wrong about some of the details, but there's this thing that's right. It's like I have it. It's right in front of me, and it can't possibly not be there. That's literally, it seems to me like necessarily false. Which I guess is you're just going to come back and say that's the meta problem, and you just think it's absurd. And we have this built-in, kind of introspective apparatus that delivers this confidence. But that seems anyway. So that's I really don't. To me, it's hard to take serious the idea that it could not really be there.
But I think it's very important because if you, I follow you. I understand this intuition that no, it cannot be that it does not exist. I mean, it's something maybe not exactly logical, but almost a priori there. Yeah. But then again, I want to say this should raise suspicions, because if this that you think is so certain was really just whatever physically series, say, consciousness is, like in certain kind of integration of information, or like retroactive loops in some part of the brain, or like certain kind of representation, all these things, we can very well imagine that we are wrong about them, right? Any of the candidates that weak illusionists want to accept, there are things about which we should not have this kind of confidence. And then, so I'm not saying that the weak illusionists cannot work out some things with like different, anyway, I'm sure they can think of something, but I think it should raise suspicion.
I'm following you there. But I guess so, just really quickly, I think there's a difference between theory and sort of what you're theorizing about. So, I think the kind of combustion example is a kind of extractive example here. So, fire is real. I mean, let's just assume for the moment we're not in a matrix or anything, or in a dream. Fire is a real thing. Is it oxidation or is it phlogiston? Well, that's a theoretical issue. And so when we eliminated phlogiston from our scientific vocabulary, we didn't eliminate fire. Fire's still there. It's the same as it always was. It's just we had a bad theory of it. But that's not the kind of view that you can take as an eliminativist about consciousness. You can't say the same thing is there that we thought was there before. It's just we have a different theory of it now.
Of course. But the thing is with fire is that I think it seems to be a very plausible point that the way we, let's say, fix the reference of fire is whatever causes such and such and such events, right? And whatever does this is fire. And then it's open what fire really is. But I thought that you didn't want to define phenomenal consciousness as whatever causes my representation of phenomenal consciousness. I thought you wanted to say that we have this more substantive grasp within introspection. And if we do that, then we have to admit that, we know what phenomenal consciousness is at some level. Yeah. And it's not just whatever plays a certain role, right?
Right. Yeah, I agree. Right. But we don't know metaphysically what it is. We simply know that we have it and it's there. So, this is why, epistemically, I do think we have a kind of special access, not super special. I don't think it's infallible. So I think, by the way, just as a side note, everybody is a weak illusionist. I don't know anyone who isn't a weak illusionist. Even David Chalmers is a weak illusionist because that's a universal thing. I don't think even the most devout, hardcore phenomenal realists are weak illusionists because, sorry, go ahead though.
No, please. I agree with this point. I think I tend to use weak illusionists in the sense in which to be a weak illusionist, you have to deny that it's not enough to say consciousness exists, even though it does not have some of the properties it seems to have, but you have to deny also some of properties that it essentially seems to have, right? Because I agree that almost everyone agrees that sometimes there are properties that phenomenal states seem to have and they don't really have, maybe about when it comes to their distribution or whatever. So I think I tend to use weak illusionists only for these people who think that phenomenal consciousness seems to have essentially certain properties and it does not really have them. And also in the sense of seems that is relatively robust, right? It's not just some people sometimes, but in a rather robust way.
In that sense, I don't think I would be a weak illusionist.
Okay. So you think all of the essential properties that phenomenal consciousness consistently seems to have, at least to enough people, it really has them.
I think that it's possible. I think possibly that it does, and it's also physical. And I don't see why I should back away from that claim. And if you say things like zombies and Mary, well, I say things like shombis, which are my physical duplicates that have consciousness. I think they're conceivable. I think Mary, if she had the concept of red, would be able to deduce from the physical facts what red. Well, I think she needs the concept first, and you don't get the concept without having the experience. So that's why she can't do it in a room. So I think there's all these ways out. I just don't really see why, what forces me to accept that there's a problem here. And by the way, we don't have to get totally hung up with this because you have so many other interesting things. So if we just want to say we can disagree on this, I think that's fine. People do disagree, but I'm just curious why people take this so seriously. It's like, okay, well, it can't be physical. So what is it? Is it idealism? Is it dualism? Is it illusionism? I still say, well, why can't it be physicalism? I just don't see what has pushed us away from that. In such a way, the way that you feel, because I think you put it really nicely, that you just really find it hard to believe and that you can't really make sense of it. It's as mysterious as transubstantiation.
Yeah.
And that's pretty hardcore. So I was thinking, really, it's mysterious as the Trinity. I just don't understand that, to be honest. And I'm not trying to play a game or be coy. I'm just honestly trying to see.
So of course, at some point it's sometimes like you have the debate in a way where it's hard to move forward. So I want to maybe do one step backward and come back to one thing that you said that I didn't answer to, but I think is important. Okay. You said one of the reasons why I want to consider physicalist realism and like an open possibility is that it is conceivable, right?
Yeah.
I can conceive, I suppose what you mean is that the like anti-zombie argument or something like that. Like I can conceive of a world where there is a creature that is my bare physical duplicate and yet is conscious.
Yeah, well, just before you continue, I don't know if you know the history of this, but Keith came up with the anti-zombie argument, and then a year later, I came up with what I call the shombi argument. We did it independently, and because then I found out afterwards, like, oh, we both came up with what I thought was the same. But now I really think that it's not the same, because I think that what Keith is saying is that an illusionism world is conceivable, whereas what I'm saying is a phenomenal realism world is conceivable, and in that world, it's physical. So I do think that there's some technical differences between the way he thinks about it and the way I think about it.
Just curiosity question, like does Keith agree? Does he agree with your way of putting in things? Because I always read, I mean, it's been a long time I've read this paper about anti-zombies. I think he wrote it a long time ago, and to me, it was not obviously an illusionist paper. For me, at this point, it was not an illusionist. That's the way I was reading it.
Yeah, but given everything else that he said about how like he doesn't find that there is no notion of qualia or phenomenal consciousness, which could be physical, it's pretty clear that he doesn't find it conceivable, the things that we're talking about, let alone possible. So maybe he didn't put it that way in his paper, but I think in the background of his thinking is this idea that, this isn't real. But for me, I want to take the hard, like someone who I think is just like Ned Block, David Chalmers, these guys, phenomenal realists of the ultimate stripe, and say whatever they're talking about, that thing could be physical. And there's nothing inconceivable or contradictory about that being physical.
Okay, so so let's consider this view. So I think my take would be twofold. So first, my intuition is that really I cannot get myself around it, and believe me, I've tried. I'm really sincere. I really tried, because that's the position that I would be on paper most attracted to. Like it seems to have lots of quality. If only I could understand that, and I cannot. And now you say, but wait, isn't it conceivable though? Where is the contradiction?
Right.
And there, I think there is something. I don't know how to spell it out exactly, if I had to do it properly in like philosophy of language terms or what. But I think there is a difference between implicit characterization and explicit characterizations. What I mean by that is that I do think that our introspective representations of phenomenal states characterize these states as being essentially a certain way. And I do think that this characterization makes it at odds with their being physical or even possibly physical. At the same time, I agree that this characterization is not some sort of linguistic characterization, and it's not an explicit characterization. So I agree that if you consider the sentence, this experience of pain is fully physical, no one can derive a contradiction of that, because anyways, the concept of experience of pain is obviously not composed in an explicit manner. So it's in a different vocabulary. So it's not clear how you could derive a contradiction from that, right? You could process it as much as you want in your little computer. You will never have a contradiction that comes out. But what I also think is that when we say that the concept that we express, the concept of like experience of pain, has an implicit characterization that is born with it. And this implicit characterization makes it so that when I try to have a positive conception of what it would be for this to be physical, I cannot find one. There is always a problem. But I agree that I would never derive an explicit contradiction. So
yeah. So this is the difference between what Chalmers calls negative and positive conceivability. So the explicit stuff is like you have to have a positive account of how it could be physical. But all you need for like conceivability arguments is the negative stuff. You just have to say there's no contradiction there.
I know that. I agree. But so again, I've not really worked that out in detail. So I don't know how I would present it exactly. But what I want to suggest is that I agree with you that I cannot derive a contradiction from like consciousness is physical, but I still think that there is something deeply problematic, and that from me comes from the fact that I have this sort of implicit characterization of what consciousness is that makes it so that whenever I try to apply the predicate physical to it, it's not a contradiction, but I think like something is off. Let me give you an example with something else. Let's take, for example, what Dave calls ebony colors, right? These colors that maybe perception, like maybe that we instinctively represent perceptually as being in the world, and then Descartes and Galileo come and say no. Right. So ebony colors, I think arguably we could say that they are characterized as primitive, or like primitive properties of surfaces. But of course, this characterization is not explicit because our perceptions are not linguistic, like they are not linguistic, they don't have a linguistic format. So if I think this, where this refers to primitive redness, if I think this is composed of microphysical properties of surfaces, there is no way I can derive a contradiction of that.
Right.
And yet it seems rather intuitive to many people that, no, but there is something weird when I try to think that this, where this is really the Edenic property redness, is a microphysical property of surface, because there is an implicit characterization of this as maybe, for example, primitive property of surface. And for me, that's the same kind of thing that is going on in the kind of consciousness. So I grant you this, that yes, there is no explicit contradiction that can be derived, so there is some sort of negative conceivability. But for this other reason, I still think that there is something problematic and a priori problematic in physicalist realism. So I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's interesting. That it brings up a kind of question that that was percolating while I was reading through a couple of your papers, which is one. So a lot of this seems reliant on introspection. So a lot of what you're talking about is like the grasp that we have of consciousness via introspection. So as a way of warming up to what I really want to ask you, let me ask you first, suppose that we were as a species incapable of introspection, that for whatever reason, we just never developed the ability. But yet we still had everything else, physically the same with us and so forth. Do you think there would be a hard problem of consciousness or anything in this area? Or do you think this only comes about because of introspection?
We don't have introspection. Do we have, what kind of metacognitive capacities we have? Nothing. We have no metacognitive capacities whatsoever.
Yeah, let's just assume that we don't have any. Yeah.
Well, then I don't see how there could be a hard problem of consciousness, but I think many people would agree with that now, because if we don't have any of the concept of representation that allow us to grasp consciousness as such or anything in the vicinity, I think even a realist would admit that a creature who is like that cannot formulate a hard problem of consciousness, right? They don't have the representation.
They might not call it the hard problem of consciousness, but wouldn't there still be the hard problem of Edenic properties, sort of the kind that you were just mentioning? Wouldn't we still have a puzzle about, if we thought the redness was out there and we never even, noticed that it was a property of us or never even thought about consciousness at all, wouldn't there still be a question about how could that red out there be a physical property of the, do you think you get the similar kind of puzzle or not?
Yeah. So I think it's hard to say, because in the end, I think my take on this is that the hard problem of consciousness is both extremely significant and extremely insignificant. What I mean by that is that I think it's extremely significant because it concerns something that seems to be everywhere. That seems to be extremely important for who we are and for what does reality consist in. But I think it's also extremely insignificant in the sense that in the end, I think it is caused by some pretty cheap tricks of introspection. Right. So I think it's a very hard problem, impossible to solve. And all the options seem crazy, all the solutions seem crazy. But I don't think the cause of this problem is something really deep or really important.
Right.
So what I mean by that is that if you ask me to imagine another creature very different, would it have something like the heart problem? I would say, maybe, maybe not. I would need to see more about this exact creature. I could very easily imagine that yes, very easily imagine that no. It really depends on the kind of representation apparatus that this creature has. Because I don't think the heart problem of consciousness arises because of some deep cognitive features that maybe all creatures must have at some level. I don't think so. I think it is significant for us, but I think there is nothing significant in its cause.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I mean, yeah, that's sort of what I thought. Because the reason why I'm thinking about this is because I was one of the puzzles that I have a lot about about illusionism is whether it's a theory of consciousness or a theory of introspection. So a lot of the ways that people put it is like, okay, it's a theory of introspection. It's an account of that we get things wrong when we introspect, that we have this thing and then we introspect it and we misrepresent it in introspection. And then there's this leap that says, oh, and because of that, this is a theory of conscious experience. But ordinary conscious experience that's non-introspective seems already like enough to generate the problems that we are interested in. That's kind of why I was asking whether you agree with me. So you said no, so I could see maybe how you're going to answer this. But
just to clear things out first, could it be that we have here a slightly different way of understanding introspection?
Yeah, possibly.
I feel like it's not really clear. Sometimes some people want to say introspection is really only when you deliberately pay attention to your experience and maybe even like grasp it in some sort of quasi linguistic terms.
Yeah,
and
that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think I'm using introspection in some sense that could also include some lower level process by which you kind of represent your own mental states, right?
I see.
That's standardly the way in which I want to use introspection. And I'm sorry if this is misleading. Maybe it is misleading in some of my papers.
No, I don't think so. I think people use it that way. But yeah, I was assuming. So what you're saying is that, like, suppose I have a toothache, and then the next day I think, man, that toothache really sucked that I had yesterday. That's introspection on your view, even though I'm not like having the conscious experience at that moment. I'm merely thinking about a conscious experience that I had like an hour ago or something. Does that count as introspection?
Like in the past, no, I don't think it would count as introspection. That counts as self-analyzing. I don't want to make it count as introspection, but at least in standard cases, like in human cases, what you're probably doing is you're probably recruiting the memory of having introspected. That's what I would assume. Right. So
tell me what it is can you say again what it is that you mean by introspection? Because now I'm a little bit so you got to be having the experience first of all, and then you think about it, and that's it.
By introspection, I want to mean processes by which we represent, with or without particularly paying attention, or with or without deliberately choosing to do so, by which we represent our current mental states in a way that is interestingly distinct from the way in which you represent my mental states.
Right.
And I don't want to say that it's essentially distinct, but at least there seems to be some interesting difference. That's what I call introspection. And so in that view, if you have some sort of self-monitoring theory that says that we permanently monitor our own internal states, right? I think I'm inclined to say, yeah, you can call that introspection too.
Okay. Yeah. So more like the David Armstrong sort of view about it.
That would count as introspection for me.
Right. Okay.
The way in which I use the term.
And so the idea is that we don't have to be, it's not deliberate. We don't have to be bracketing the world in the famous Husserl whatever way. But rather it's just any way in which we come to know about our own conscious experiences. But there, see, this puzzles me because again, take the the pain of the tooth example. I just recently had a root canal, so these things have been on my mind lately. But it seems like a lot of what. So if I go to the doctor, they say, "Where does it hurt?" I say, "It hurts, in my left tooth or whatever." Does that require? It doesn't seem like that requires introspection to me because I'm thinking about my tooth and the pain in the tooth, apparently, as it seems to me. So is that that doesn't really seem introspective to me. It seems like I'm thinking about things out there, like, you know,
Yeah.
it hurts on my toe.
So I think it's quite it's true that the case of pain is always very problematic for everyone who wants to distinguish introspection from perception, because it seems that when we focus on pain, it's not like there seems, and I agree, to be always some sort of fine line between, am I focusing on my jaw, right, my tooth, or am I focusing on the way I experience it?
Right.
And then what I would say is that, so I'm not a view particularly about that, right?
Okay.
I think I'm inclined to think that perception and like perceptive tasks and introspective tasks are obviously very much related. And it might be, in my view, that what makes introspection and perception differ is that in the case of introspection, there is some sort of recruitment of representation provided by our theory of mind module that comes and is sort of annexed, like added to maybe some perceptual or quasi-perceptual representation. So I'm also okay with the view in which, well, maybe in many cases, it's not really clear if we are introspecting or perceiving, and maybe we're just saying things in some sort of mental vocabulary, but maybe what we are really doing mentally is perceiving. So I would be okay with that, because I do think that there is a close relation between what we do when we perceive and what we do when we introspect, because I think introspection sort of piggybacks on the doings of perception.
Yeah. So once you have that view of introspection in mind, then it seems hard to motivate. At least I'm getting a little bit lost on how one, I'm sure I'm just confused, but how one motivates the argument for illusionism based on introspection. Because I took it that you needed something like, you know, direct phenomenal concepts, or, you know, these kinds of more heavy duty notions where you have a seemingly, because the way you put it earlier was like, there's an acquaintance relationship or some kind of crap that seemingly is going on there. And that's the mysterious bit, is this non-causal way of knowing about, like, a direct grasp of the conscious experience, or how this, you know, those sorts of things don't really seem to play a role in the kind of thing that you're calling introspection.
So I'm not sure I got your question, because in my view, of course, when you talk about consciousness and also when you talk about introspection, I think you should always distinguish two things carefully. Okay. One is what really exists, right? And then what really exists for me is a kind of process of introspection, of which I gave a few elements. I'm not sure I want to be committed to details for everything. There are some aspects where I'm happy to just not have an opinion, but like I have a certain view about what introspection really is. And I have also a view about what consciousness really is. So in my case, it does not really exist, except in some quasi-phenomenal sense. And then there is a view of what appears to exist. And then this problematic phenomenality, yes. And then maybe also there is some sort of acquaintance relation that appears to hold, right? In the sense that it seems to us that we have this acquaintance relation, but that's not in the domain of what really exists, right? That's just in the domain of what appears to exist. Right. And no, I'm not sure I understand. And then I'm coming back.
Well, here, let me try to put it slightly different way, because I take your point. I think it's good to make that distinction, especially when you're talking to someone who holds a view like yours. Here's, I mean, maybe I'm open to the idea that I'm just misunderstanding what's going on here. So hopefully this will help clear my misunderstanding. So I thought what you were saying was that in introspection, we come to believe that there are these essential properties that phenomenal consciousness has. And those are the properties, if you're an illusionist, then you have to deny, but either strong or weak variety, you have to deny that there really are things which instantiate those properties. But then in your just talking about introspection, it doesn't seem like that sort of thing has anything to do with these essential, I mean, where's the attribution of essential properties in this kind of casual introspection thing?
Okay, no, I understand. Okay, so in my view, what happens is that you have the going-ons of perception, let's say, and then you have some sort of introspective process, which I sometimes hypothesize as being based on some sort of theory of mind module, which takes up perceptual representations and adds some sort of operator, right? Probably it's more complicated than that. I'm just doing a very simple story. And so you have the act of perception, which is judging this is red, and probably red being originally characterized as some sort of primitive property of surface. And then you have the working of the theory of mind modules that just takes up this judgment, and at least in certain situations, I don't know if it's permanent or if just when attention is given, add something and say, I have an experience of red.
Right.
And I think the problematic essential properties happen in the characterization of experience. I think experience is like this representational operator used by our theory of mind module. I think experience has all sorts of implicit commitments, and these implicit commitments makes it so that phenomenal consciousness cannot be located in the physical world, right? That's what makes it problematic.
Right. And so you think that it seems that way? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, in introspection, does it appear that way to us? Because oftentimes in the kinds of things you're talking about in introspection, it doesn't seem to appear that way to me at all. So if you take the Armstrong view, or any kind of higher order view about consciousness, like David Rosenthal's or whoever, I've defended a version of these in places as well, but I'm not super committed to it. But anyway, then ordinary conscious experience always involves something like an introspective element, but it doesn't seem like all the problematic stuff is there. It just says, I'm in a certain state of a certain kind.
Of course, yes.
No, yeah,
I agree with that. That's why, so here I will give the same answer as previously. I think it's all about the implicit characterization, because I don't think this characterization that leads to the problems, I don't think it's explicit, right? So I don't think, so to speak, if you like the language or thought approach or metaphor, I don't think we have little words in our language of thought that says, I'm in a state that is, and then explicitly non-physical and problematic and this and that, right?
Right, so I mean, it's hard for me not to hear what you're saying as saying that there are certain theoretical considerations that you want to smuggle in here and attribute to introspection, which I don't really see the reason. I don't really see them showing up. So what you call implicit, I don't really, it doesn't seem like that's a part of the kind of introspection that I do.
Okay. So here's my description of how we disagree, and then I would try to give arguments. So what I'm saying is that, well, when we introspect phenomenal states, we have this explicitly simple and uncomposed representation, but really with lots of implicit commitments. And they are responsible for the hard problem of consciousness arising and all these kind of things. You're saying, no, I don't think so. For example, what you might be saying is that all of these problematic commitments, they only arise because people adopt theories, because people are just too convinced by Descartes or whoever else, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So my reasons to think that I'm correct is, so, and now, like, I have to appeal to different things, but one would think I would say is that, well, if I'm correct, that would nicely account for the fact that whatever our exact philosophical beliefs, like even if I really want to believe in materialism, I can still find intuitively that there is something really problematic with consciousness. Because if it was really all about adopting a theory or having read Descartes, then we should see some sort of pattern there. Like really, if you believe in dualism, then you should have the intuition, and if you don't, you should not.
Right.
And honestly, I don't find it plausible at all. Again, I tried hard to be.
But I like what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying. But let me try this on you, because what it sounds like you're saying is you should explicitly hold the theory, but what I'm saying, it sounds like you implicitly hold it, or in other words, that you know, maybe you're not even aware that you had these theoretical commitments or a certain theoretical way of thinking about things, which gets smuggled in.
Okay.
And then you want to say, look, the thing is not real because it's connected to these implicit things, but the implicit things seem optional, actually. And many people who are physicalists, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, so it just seems like, I'm repeating myself, but it seems like you're sneaking something in here.
No, I think I understand your point. So just to be, but I just want to be clear about what your view would entail and why it also has a cost, right?
Okay.
Because if you say, well, it's because you have implicit theoretical commitments, let's still agree that they are implicit. Then if it's still a theory, something that I've adopted at some point, it should not be beyond like reasonably simple means to just abandon this theory. I should just be able to work hard enough for 6 months and then boom, I'm healed. And really, that's not the case. So if that's the case, then it's a pretty special case of implicit theoretical commitment. That's possible, but I think like the cost goes up. That's what I mean. The second thing that I want to say is just that. So I forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, no, yeah, I remember what I wanted to say. So I think what I'm saying, of course, is not that. So I'm saying there is this implicit commitments just in our representation of phenomenal states, in our introspective representation of phenomenal states, and I'm assuming here that it's kind of innate, or at least very robustly present in human beings, right?
Okay.
But the consequence, of course, is not that we should all be dualist. It's not enough that we should be reluctant to accept all explicit sentences that express a physicalist view. It just means that when probed in the appropriate manner, we should have intuitions that goes against that. But of course, we might still have lots of considerations that makes us want to still accept the explicit formulation of a physicalist view. And so, for example, in my view, you also have the same kind of phenomenal introspection mechanism as I do. It's just that you think that there are lots of good reasons to be a physicalist, and so you choose to ignore this pull to be, no, this is physical, but you still have the pull. And my view is that you have the pull not because you have read too much Descartes. I think you have the pull because that's probably how your brain is made to function in the first place. That's my view.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the view. I mean, it's interesting, but and to be honest, when I was younger, I was a dualist. Partially
You read
because
too much Descartes.
Well, even before I read Descartes, when I read Descartes, I was like, aha, now I know why I'm a dualist. But it was more like because of my kind of experiences that I had. I felt like, when I was younger, I did hallucinogens, for example. And I was like, psilocybin convinced me that there's more, the cosmic consciousness is real. I had a kind of like experience that I thought presented that to me. And then I became convinced that that was a mistake. But so maybe you're right that I was smuggling some theoretical. I mean, I think that the problem here is that we think that terms like consciousness, phenomenal consciousness are theoretically neutral, but I think really they aren't. I think they carry baggage with them. And if you think especially like that it's just a simple thing that we're directly acquainted with, then of course it's going to be mysterious how it could be made part of the physical world, because we need to have a theory to embed it, to make sense of it, and embed it into the world. Yeah. So there's that. I find people like Dave and illusionists too, I think, because they agree with Dave about how to characterize consciousness. I think that whole approach builds in the problematic aspect from the beginning by saying, look, this is so different, so special, it can't be physical. And then they go, look, it's not physical. But that's because of the way they're thinking, the way they conceptualize the phenomenon to begin with.
Yeah. So I agree with that, with the difference, with the difference that I don't think that this way of conceptualizing comes from some sort of nefarious cultural influence of any kind. So I think on this point, actually, you probably agree more with Keith, right? Because I think Keith is more inclined to think that whatever theories philosophers have developed might be to blame for or false impressions about consciousness. I'm not inclined to think so.
Okay, interesting.
One reason why so it might be for different reasons. One might be just my own case. Like I feel like, no, really, it just seems to be this way to me, whatever I think, whatever I believe, whatever philosophical beliefs I endorse. One other is, I must say, even though I know this is very debated, is I think when I read lots of like history of philosophy, I feel, at least since Descartes and people following that, I feel like we are really talking about very similar things. So I know some people say, no, actually, the debate has changed very much. And I've not studied the question extensively, but my intuition is that no, we are really talking about the same thing. And that would be so surprising that we are talking about the same things if really that was so dependent on some theoretical framework. Also, I'm always surprised at how simple it is to get into the problem. When you're a teenager, you often have like glimpses of this kind of problem, I think, way before you really go into philosophy and read Descartes or whoever is a modern Cartesian, right? So I think that's my intuition. My intuition is that sometimes people are saying, this is all because of Descartes, or more recent, this is all because of Chalmers. I think they are giving, in some sense, too much credit to influential thinkers, for sure. But I don't think they are the cause of us wondering about that.
Right.
That's my intuition.
Yeah, no, that makes, and that's in some sense, I agree with you about that. Yeah, I can see what you're saying, because I was sort of agreeing with the Keith line, with the Frankish's line about it's the way, I mean, I don't know. So I go back and forth on this actually, because it does seem to me that it's not clear how widespread these intuitions are. And there may be some bias because the people who are really puzzled with them end up going, I mean, it's the same thing about philosophy of religion. Like a lot of the people who work in philosophy of religion are religious. Why? Because they're really puzzled about it. And so they kind of go that way. And so maybe the philosophers of mind who are interested in consciousness are those who have this, thing, but it's not 100% clear. I think there's some experimental philosophy on this too. It's not really clear that the average typical naive subject has these problems that we think are there, which lends some credence to the, maybe it's not the philosopher's fault, but maybe instead it's the philosophers who think this way, who then are drawn into philosophy, therefore it's still being the philosopher's fault in some roundabout sense.
So I've read some of the experimental philosophy things about that, and I must say, I'm not sure I'm not sure it can settle much as it's done currently. I'm not saying in the future, as it's done currently. Yeah. And my problem with that is that I'm not sure we can really get at the issue. For example, me as someone who believes that in the end, the solution to the meta problem has to lie in introspection. Right? The reason why there seems to be a hard problem is because something that has to do with introspection. The problem that I have with at least all the experimental philosophy studies on dualist intuitions so far is that I think they are too far remote from introspective tasks. So they don't anchor the questions in introspective tasks. They usually ask questions about an imaginary creature and ask like, is this robot conscious? Does it feel that way? And I feel like because it's so far remote and ordinary concepts are so potentially polysemic when like experience or consciousness, I don't think they could detect what we would like to detect. And I think in the future, I hope what would be done, because I think it's a very important question, what will be done to explore dualist intuitions and or robust they are or widespread they are. I think it would be really great to try to do that by anchoring the questionnaire in introspective tasks or tasks that force to distinguish between introspection and perception, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, because I think that this is a real problem. I like that you brought this up because, it sort of reminds me of like the work from Paul Bloom, the psychologist, who says, we're all sort of, maybe this is sort of what's in the back of your thinking too, is like the humans are kind of natural dualists. It's kind of born into us, but it's not really clear what Bloom's evoking from his subjects, because we tend to use contrasts whenever, but I mean, ordinary people, I'm kind of saying we, like I'm an ordinary person, although obviously I'm very corrupted at this point. But ordinary persons tend to use these kind of contrasts when they don't really think there's a contrast there. So we say human versus animal, but we all know humans are animals, but there's a relevant contrast there. We're a special kind of animal. And we say physical versus mental. And that doesn't really seem to me to suggest that we think the mental isn't physical. It just, maybe it's a special case of the physical.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And one last thing, so it's more anecdotal, but I think it's important. One last thing, one reason why I'm not fully convinced about some of the studies that I've seen where, for example, people are asked about whether or not they would accept that consciousness can be entirely explained by the brain, is that I think that really most people don't understand the problem. I remember because I did not understand the problem either. Like I would, for example, call myself a materialist for many years, but I had a certain idea of what it meant to be a materialist, which in fact turned out to be perfectly compatible and even leaning towards what most philosophers of mind would call property dualism, right?
Right.
And as this experience,
or non-reductive physicalism. I mean, you just didn't read, I said, or non-reductive physicalism. You just weren't exposed to a good non-reductive physicalist.
Yeah, maybe two, yeah. And also, for example, I don't know if you have the same experience, but I have this experience when I don't do it this year, but I did a few years like teaching philosophy of mind to undergraduates. I always do little surveys, like what's your view on this debate when I teach hard problem of consciousness? And really, I'm very surprised by the number of students every year who start by saying, of course, I'm a materialist. Of course, consciousness is all in the brain. And then at the end of the class, they say, oh no, actually, I'm not a materialist at all. That's super weird. How can you really think that? And really, it happens every year. So it's anecdotal, but that feeds my sense that if we want to really probe what we want to probe, anti-physicalist intuitions, we probably have to have some sort of like finer grain than what I've seen used for now. I think it's good that there are studies in that direction, but I'm not sure they can prove what we would like them to prove at this stage.
It's a fair point, and I think it's a good note for the experimental philosophers. Just anecdotally, I have the opposite experience in the class. I end up with a lot of students saying, what's the big deal? I think it's possibly because of how we're presenting the material. You're presenting as like, oh, it's very puzzling. And I'm presenting like, what's the big deal? And so I think that does influence maybe the way students respond. So that's one thing I guess I would say. But yeah, I take you. You're raising a lot of interesting points and making me think about this stuff in a new way. So I like that. But I noticed. So let's put a pin in the physicalism discussion for a second, if you don't mind, because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about, first of all, the meta problem, which I don't know if the illusion meta problem, which is different than the sort of Chalmers meta problem, right? So can you tell us a little bit about? I mean, we've been sort of dancing around this whole time, but let's just get it out.
You're right. So just one word first about, so what Chalmers calls the meta problem is the problem of explaining why we tend to seek and believe that there is a hard problem of consciousness. That's what he calls the meta problem. So what I called the illusion meta problem. So actually I wrote, of course, that before knowing that Chalmers was writing this paper, and it was accepted in press, and then I learned, too bad, like the same name, or almost the same name, has been taken by one of the most influential philosophers of mine currently alive. So of course, everyone is going to forget my thing, right? And so what
your thing is actually the more important thing, actually, I would say.
What do you mean, sorry?
I say your thing is the more important, the more interesting thing.
So the illusion meta problem, I saw it as a problem for illusionism, but you don't necessarily have to. So it was drawing on Frankish illusion problem. Frankish said, if you're an illusionist, you replace the hard problem of consciousness with the illusion problem. The illusion problem being, how come we have the illusion of consciousness even though it's not there? How come it appears to us that we are phenomenally conscious? And what I said is something like that. In the end, if we just look at this question, maybe it's not that hard to explain why it seems to us that we are phenomenally conscious. After all, lots of things seems to us to be the case and are not the case in perceptual illusions, for example. So if really that was only the question, why does it seem to be the case that we are conscious even though we are not? We could recruit tons of possible models of explanation, like drawing on like perceptual illusion models, for example, although not only. And that's what some people have done, right? Some people thought about the illusion of consciousness as some sort of quasi-perceptual illusion, sometimes comparing it to the Müller-Lyer illusion. Right. But what I'm saying is that, well, there is an important contrast between most, if not all, illusions and the hypothetical illusion of consciousness. And the contrast is this. Let's take any non-phenomenal concrete stuff, like this red notebook, a glass, two hands. I perceive this stuff. It seems to me that I can very easily contemplate the possibility that these things do not exist even though they appear to exist. Right. I can make lots of scenarios, like dream scenarios, brain in a vat scenarios, massive hallucination scenarios. It doesn't mean that I believe in any of these scenarios. And actually it would be pretty hard to make me believe in any of them, but I can quite easily contemplate these scenarios as a possibility. What makes the illusion of consciousness so special, so to speak, so weird, is that people, including myself, have the hardest time contemplating the possibility that this, where this tries to capture their current phenomenal experience, does not exist even though it appears to exist. And at this point I say, yeah, I think most people think it's crazy. And I understand, I also, on the face of it, find it a little bit crazy. How could it be that this does not exist even though it seems to exist? Right. And I said, this is an illusion meta problem. And what I also said, argued, so I think it was in a paper in 2018, I also tried to argue is that one wrong way to try to solve this problem is to say, in the end, it's just a matter of the strength of our belief, or the strength of our disposition to believe. Because some people, I think, would like to go that way. It's just that we are much more convinced in the first place that we are conscious than of the existence of anything else. Right. And in my way, they are taking things wrongly. Why? Because I can think of some things that I'm extremely convinced of. For example, I have two hands right now. God, I'm convinced of that. It would take you, I don't know what it would take you to convince me that I'm not. Maybe you could. I don't think you alone could. Maybe I could have a bunch of evidence to convince me that I don't have two hands right now. But given my situation, I don't think you could convince me that I don't have two hands right now. And yet, I have no problem contemplating the possible situation in which, in fact, it is an illusion, right? Right. And similar, but as opposed to consciousness, when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, it's not just that I resist the negation of my belief that I'm phenomenally conscious. It is that I have some sort of like conception problem, representation problem to contemplate this hypothesis that I'm not really phenomenally conscious. It just seems to me that I am. And I said a good illusionist theory, but no, I would even add a good theory, even not an illusionist one, should give an account of why is it? Why is it that we have this trouble conceiving of such a situation?
Right.
And yeah.
And that's really, so, I mean, I know you have an answer in terms of introspection, which we're going to get to. It's the TCE. Is that the right acronym? I forget the, is it TCE or? Okay, yeah. So we're going to get to that in a second. But so if you have these two, so the thing that I was thinking when I was reading through all this stuff in your papers on this was, given that there is, so I agree with you, like, you know, a lot of people find it absurd, you know, like Galen Strawson says, the silliest idea in the history of the universe. And you have a lot of that kind of dramatic rhetoric, like people who are like, I don't really myself go in for that dramatic kind of rhetoric, but I certainly get the feeling, like I understand that, yeah, this is absurd. Like it's right there that you're telling me that it's not, and that's just, and even if it's illusions or experiences, you can do all the sort of things that people do. So if you have that illusion meta problem and you put it up against the kind of feeling that you have about realism, physicalism, realist physicalism, and you say, well, no, that's absurd too. So you have these two things, which on the face of it, according to you, are sort of absurd. Isn't one more absurd than the, I mean, so is it the, what I'm trying to figure out is your own reasoning here. So is it that what you're thinking is, aha, I have a strategy to explain why I think it's so absurd in the case of illusionism, but I can't envision any strategy like that working for realism. So that's what makes illusionism more plausible. Is that the kind of argument, overarching meta argument?
Okay, I see. So it's a good question, because I think when you answer questions about motivations, there is always, for example, a tension between your actual motivations when you endorsed the view, what led you to something, and the way you would like to present it in an argument. Right. And often they are not the same, right?
Right, yeah, so, totally.
I don't know if I would draw an argument like that. I would have to think more about whether I want to draw the argument like that. But I think what I would like to say is that definitely I try to, one thing that I did, for example, in my first years of PhD is really try to look at the different explanations of why we would be so reluctant to accept that this is physical, even though it is. And I found all of them extremely implausible. So you could say in some sense, yeah, maybe I found them too implausible. Like, for example, typically the view of David Papineau, which I think otherwise as an extremely impressive theory of consciousness, but this view that we commit antipathetic fallacy, for example. Yeah. I work quite a lot on that.
And you have a whole paper on that. It's a great paper, by the way.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think that the view that we commit a fallacy, I don't know. I think that lots of reasons to think that it's not what is going on. It's not that we systematically commit a fallacy. For one thing, there is not the same kind of psychological pattern than in standard fallacy. So if it's a fallacy, that would be a very weird kind of fallacy. Second, it's not clear that it predicts all the occurrence of the intuition, etc., etc. So in some sense, yeah, you could say I proceeded like that. But another way to look at it is to look at it this way. And I think I discussed that with Keith, and I suspect he would agree with me. The thing with illusionism is that the really hard part is the first step. But once you look at illusionism from the inside, once you like bracket the rest and look at it from the inside, I find it really makes sense. It allows really to make sense of lots of things. It solves lots of problems. And I think it also gives a sense that we can make lots of progress too, because then there are lots of things that we can study, lots of questions that were impossible to solve. It makes sense now what they are impossible to solve. They are just verbal issues, or like there are issues about things that do not exist. So I think illusionism is extremely uncomfortable on the first step. While for physicalist realism, I feel like, no, it's uncomfortable all the way down, because I have to accept that there is always something that I don't understand. The second difference that might be relevant is that in some sense for me, illusionism requires me to accept that what goes wrong is my introspection, right? Like I introspect something and this goes wrong, and then I just reason too much on that, so I cannot go out of the illusion, and the illusion meta problem, and it's my solution to the illusion meta problem that we'll discuss later. But the problem for me with physicalist realist is that it forces me to think that in some sense it's more my reasoning that goes wrong, right? Yeah. And I don't know.
That's sensitive. Yeah, you don't want to. Yeah, that's strikes to the core.
Yeah, for me it's easier to think. Well, I live in the cavern. Right, because that's what illusionism says in the sense. Like I live in the cavern. There are lots of shadows, and I'm just seduced by these shadows and I don't see what the reality of the world is. But to say, no, it's not just like you live in a cave and you have illusion. It's also your very faculty of reasoning just goes wrong. I don't know. I find that deeply uncomfortable to accept.
Yeah.
So that would be one way to put it, maybe.
That's interesting too. In the background are all sorts of things about, because I find that less uncomfortable since I tend to think that this happens quite often. But I like this. I like this answer that you're given. So what is your proposed solution? It's that there's a kind of hardwired introspective capacity that we have that just gets it wrong because that's the way it was built up.
Okay, so so let's say that there is two levels to the story. The first level is the one that allows to solve the illusion problem. And then we'll focus on the part that allows to solve what I see as a sub-part of the illusion problem, which is the illusion meta problem. Okay. So the illusion problem is that, yes, we have some sort of hardwired mechanism, introspective mechanism, which I think recruits our theory of mind modules. And it just probably reliably tracks some property from the brain, but it deeply mischaracterizes these properties as phenomenal properties, right? And also, when you look at it that way, I don't think there is anything surprising or weird about the idea that we'd have some innate, domain-specific representational mechanism that would deeply mischaracterize whatever it tracks, because it happens all the way in other domains, right? If you think about, for example, probably visual perception mischaracterizes colors as primitive properties that they are not really. You can also see that naive physics, for example, probably tracks some patterns, but mischaracterizes the things that are out there, like things that are like forces such as impetus or sucking, and there are no such thing in reality. Right? So what I want to say is that when you look at it that way, there is nothing very surprising in the idea of a hardwired representational domain-specific mechanism that is efficient in certain very limited contexts, but that happens to deeply mischaracterize the essence of the real thing out there that it more or less tracks, or at least tracks well enough to be evolutionary useful, right? So that's the first part of the story. But of course, if you just go there, then you're like, okay, then why do I have more problem accepting illusionism about phenomenal consciousness than I have problem accepting illusionism about any other thing that seems intuitive and is computed by my innate representational mechanism? For example, there are lots of things that are very intuitive. Let's think about like not only like the existence of colors as properties of surfaces, but also like let's say the reality of absolute simultaneity, right? I think it's super intuitive that two events either happen at the same time or don't, and that it really means something absolutely. And yet our best science tells us no, there is no such thing without a point of reference.
Right.
And anyway, but what I say is that we have lots of domain-specific representational mechanisms that mischaracterize things in the world. But for consciousness, we have a specific, peculiar difficulty in accepting that there is this deep mischaracterization, that the thing that we represent is not really out there. And that's the illusion meta problem. So what is my solution? So first, at a high level of generality, my solution is this. I think that the mechanism by which we represent our phenomenal experiences, so phenomenal introspection, say, is deeply intertwined with the mechanism by which we represent our epistemic situations or evidential situations. So this is at a high level of generality, right? But the idea is that what's the problem? What's the deal with consciousness? The deal with phenomenal consciousness is that we think of it as something that cannot really, at least not systematically or not massively, appear otherwise than it is, right? It cannot appear massively non-veridically. And we have I think we have strong intuition regarding that.
Right. Yeah.
And so where does the explanation lie? And I think in the end, by the way, you could accept this explanation even if you're not an illusionist. The explanation is that why maybe it is that the kind of intuitive ways in which we conceive of evidential situations, what appears to us, maybe this set of representation is in some sense linked or intertwined with our phenomenal, introspective phenomenal representations. And this intertwining maybe is what makes things go wrong, in the sense that for anything in the world, we can always think, well, this thing appears to be the case, but is not really the case. But for consciousness, this breaks down, right?
Right.
So that's my view, and that I really think it's true. I really think that is something. I think I would bet something on it. And then what I also try to do in my PhD and then in some papers that I published in English is try to do some speculation about how possibly mechanism that could explain that, right? That could explain this intertwining between our representation of evidential situations and of phenomenal introspection. So what I try to speculate, and this is more speculative, like this second part of the story, I try to put it just out there to see, look, there are things that could work, but I don't feel married to this view, right? Like this speculative hypothesis is something like this. Maybe phenomenal introspection, as well as the way we conceive of evidential situations, maybe this relies in some sort of resemblance rule, right? Maybe we conceive appearances, like what appears to a subject, as something that is grounded in resemblance, in the sense that we think that things appear to subjects when they are in states that resembles these things in certain ways, right? That's one thing. And maybe at the same time, we represent experiences as resembling certain external states of affairs. So maybe that's what phenomenal introspection tells us about our experience of red, is that it resembles Edenic redness. It's some sort of mental version of Edenic redness.
Right.
And then I try to say, well, if we think of experiences as making whatever they resemble to appear, then they would make appear like the external state of affairs that they resemble to, like redness. But also there will be some sort of annoying byproduct, which is that because experiences trivially resemble themselves, because everything resembles themselves, and they will also be conceived as making themselves appear. And on the other end, because in order for us to have an experience that appear to us, we need to be in a state that resembles that experience. And so we will think that in order for us to have an experience that appear to us, we'll be in a state that needs to resemble as much as possible an experience, so be itself an experience. So we'll also think of experience as something that cannot appear massively non-veridically, right?
Yeah.
So this is highly speculative. This is some sort of like toy model of how possibly could phenomenal introspection on the one hand and our innate mechanism for representing evidential situation on the other end be intertwined, so that the output is that we think of consciousness as something that, well, when we have it, it must in some sense be given to us, it must in some sense be available for us to inspect, it must appear to us. And on the other hand, when it appears to us, it must in some sense really be there.
Right.
I think these are,
yeah, I have a bunch of questions. So one, going back to what you were saying at the beginning, I do wonder what you think evolutionarily is the advantage of having a system like this, because certainly I can imagine a case where we have an introspective system that doesn't misrepresent the quasi-phenomenal states, or that just says they're in these states, and it could even be a simple user interface like the people like Dennett famously coined. But why does it? What's beneficial, or what reason will we expect evolution to select or favor this kind of mechanism over one that was more accurate and didn't attribute these implicit weird properties to the things it's tracking?
Of course. So I think what I would say at this point is that, of course, I don't think there is a sense in which you can give let's say a fully adaptationist story for why we have this defective mechanism. But what you can say to counter the worry that this quest for an adaptation story could raise, what you can say is this. First, clearly this mechanism will misrepresent the essence of the state thought about, but this misrepresentation will not be problematic in any context that our ancestors had to deal with. Because what I think is that basically the only context in which this will start creating serious problems is when you start doing some metaphysics of the mind. It's like, but what is really this weird thing that consciousness is, right? But before you start asking these questions, this aspect of our phenomenal introspection mechanism will not be a problem for you, right?
Right.
So you don't need this, it does not need to be, there is no reason to think that it will be selected against, right? So now, of course, you can say, why do we have this rather than another one? I think the answer probably lies in a mix of adaptation and exaptation. So my view would be, well, the thing is, we had lots of the components of such a phenomenal introspection mechanism already there in the first place, right? We had probably representation of external states of affairs as being made of qualities. And then we probably had a concept of resemblance, like some sort of naive, rough ways of computing resemblance between two things. And after all, when things are there, evolution just recruits them and tinkers with them to do something. And maybe that's the way we ended up with that, right? But what I want to say is that, of course, I'm not very convinced of this story, right? That's not something that I want to necessarily defend in the first place. But what is important for me is to say first, there is nothing surprising in the idea that we have an innate mechanism that deeply misrepresents what it represents, because that's always the case. Second, whatever errors these systems makes are not errors that would normally lead to loss of fitness for our ancestors. I don't think it even leads to loss of fitness now, so I don't think it definitely led to loss of fitness for our ancestors. Right? I don't think that illusionists have more offspring than non-illusionists. I don't think so. It's not selected against. So I think in the end, like if I'm right, of course there is a causal story in evolution to explain why we have that. But I don't think I have to provide a strong adaptationist story, because what I'm describing doesn't have to be selected against. And in lots of cases, we end up with slightly suboptimal systems, as long as...
Yeah, but that exact argument seems to sort of present a problem, to me anyway, because it seems to suggest, I mean, evolution usually works by variation. There's a bunch of different stuff. And then that's why, there's so many different species and so forth and so on. So it tries all sorts of things, and then the things that don't work out die off. So it seems like the prediction here would be that there should be other sorts of systems, because they wouldn't be selected against either. And if there's variation, then it seems like, maybe you would expect in the course of history something that was more accurate than ours, maybe even within the population, maybe in Australians is more accurate, and, in the French less accurate, or, whatever. Americans terribly inaccurate, obviously. But it just seems like it would be kind of a miracle if it all worked out just this way, given that there's no pressure for or against it, and it's totally an adaptation. It just seems like the prediction would be.
Okay. So I'm not a good philosopher of evolutionary biology, right? So I don't know how I should exactly draw the argument, but one thing that you could say first is look at what other kind of innate representational mechanisms we have, and do they variate as much? And I think there are lots of arguments to say that, for example, core theory of mind regarding beliefs and desire does not vary very much from subject to subject, maybe in some pathological case, at least that we discussed, but in so-called normal subjects, I think there is the idea, and there is not much variation. And I don't think there is any sort of like ethnic or national variation.
And you think that's innate?
Sorry?
You think those are innate capacities?
Yeah. I mean, lots of people say that. I'm not saying it's proven or what. I'm just saying it seems to be at least out there as a theory accepted by quite a lot of people, that maybe there is a core theory of mind module regarding like ascriptions of beliefs and desires, and this is innate, and this does not have much variation across subjects.
Right.
The same could be said arguably about naive physics. So what I mean by taking these examples is that it's not that clear that there should be lots of variation. And second, I take your point that, well, after all, why isn't there other alternatives that appear? If this version is not that much better than the other, why shouldn't be other alternatives? Then I think there is something about, I think one could appeal, I suppose, to the concept of the evolutionary landscape, which is that once you have a mechanism that has appeared, it changes the evolutionary landscape, which is that maybe this mechanism is not the best to do task A, but when it's there, it's more costful to evolve a new mechanism than just stick to mechanism X, right? There would have been better mechanisms, but once this mechanism is out there, it would just spread, and it would probably be the only game in town, because it changes the evolutionary landscape, and it's very hard to go up when you're in a little hole, right? So, to really spread it out, we need more work, but you see the idea, and I think it's intriguing.
Totally. Yeah. So, but it also seems to like lead to the prediction that you would have these kinds of cases where you misattribute experiences to other persons if they are sharing this common pathway about theory of mind. I should be able to have. So what makes it special about my case that, I have access to my mental? Why don't I have the feeling like I could have access to your mental states? If really all that's going on is this kind of introspective, why can't I have a kind of extrospection of your mental states, which is as convincing to me? But we don't ever see that. And most people find that if it really is just this kind of, well, I attribute to myself these states with these certain properties, why do I attribute them to myself as opposed to you? There doesn't seem to be any.
Okay, so I'm not sure I really understand the question. Maybe I'm missing something, because it seems to me that we do attribute experiences to others.
Right, but not in this way.
In the same way. Oh, so your question is, why don't we introspect experiences of others?
Yes. It seems like a prediction of your view that it should be possible. But it's obviously not. So it seems
I'm going to give a very annoying answer that sometimes philosophers give, but I'm not sure I see why it's more a problem for my views than for the other views. I think it's a very annoying answer, because after all, if it's a problem for the other views, but not really in that case. I'm not sure I see why it would be more a problem for me than for any view of introspection that thinks that introspection relies on some sort of any kind of mechanisms, because after all, why don't you just introspect yours, and why sometimes the mechanism does not dysfunction and then start ascribing experiences with someone else?
Well, because in other views, we have access to something that's there, and we're sort of getting some aspects of it right.
Okay, I see.
Whereas here, we're misrepresenting what's going on there.
Okay, I see.
And it seems like I could just as easily misrepresent what's going on with you.
Okay, I see. Okay, I understand. But so I would not really answer the problem. I would just say why I don't think it's really more a problem from my view. I would say, well, of course, this introspection mechanism that we all have, I think, does not operate in thin air. Like, it has in some sense access to something. It's just that it deeply misrepresents that things. But it's still deeply connected to lots of the other going on in the brain. That's why I do believe that phenomenal introspection will reliably track something about the brain. Like, I think that when people say, sincerely, I feel pain right now, I believe that there is very probably some sort of thing that is like reliably tracked by that. Right. So in that sense, there is some similarity between whatever mechanism I posit for phenomenal introspection and what standard inner sense theorists or others think. Like, the difference for me is just in the content of the representation. I think the content of the phenomenal, of the introspective representation of phenomenal states is deeply implicitly committed to lots of things, and that's what creates the problem.
Right, but so it just still seems like on this kind of view, there is an in principle possibility that I could misrepresent your states that way, which seems sort of absurd, like that I could feel like I have access to your conscious experiences because I simply attribute to us. I have access to something, your behavior. You know, you're moving around, you're saying ouch, and I say, oh, he's in pain, and I could misrepresent that in the same way I misrepresent my own pains. And so if that doesn't actually happen, all right, but it seems like it could. Your view doesn't rule it out, but that seems deeply weird that we would have this kind of illusion about the other person's experience. I don't know. So it seems like there's something special about our own case here.
Yeah, if I try to think about what would happen if I felt like I could introspect your let's say.
Oh, sorry, you just cut out for a second. I missed what you said at the beginning.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So if I try to think for 1 second about what, let's say I'm in a situation where it seems to me for one moment that I'm introspecting your pain. What I think you will accept is that what would happen probably in that case is that it would feel like, so first of all, is it sure that we never do that? Some people say that in empathy, maybe we can do that, like we can feel the other person's pain. I'm not a good expert on what empathy is. I know there are lots of distinctions and things to say about empathy, but anyway, but even if we agree that it does not work, so it does not happen. So what happens is I feel like I introspect your pain, and the likely outcome is that I will think, oh, but in fact, that means that I was just feeling pain myself, or maybe being in pain led me to feel some sort of thing that resembles pain or is a bit like pain, right? And so your question is that, how is it in your view that whenever I introspect someone else's pain, then I'll always end up self-ascribing that pain, right? So I do think actually it might be a problem for other views too, but I'm still trying to take it up. So how can I explain it in my view? Well, one thing that I could say maybe is that if I introspect your pain, and so, for example, if I'm in a situation where it appears to me that you're in pain, I should be, maybe there is an argument to be drawn for the idea that then I should be in a state that then has to resemble pain itself. So really, in order for it to be the case that it appears to me in sort of low-level introspective way that you are in pain, then maybe according to my TCE view about the resemblance rule theory, that maybe it would need for me to think that I'm in a state that in some sense resembles pain to make the pain in question appear, and then I would need myself to be in pain. So actually, maybe I can make it a prediction of my view. And then there would be, of course, other senses in which it can seem to me that you're in pain, but not in the same sort of immediate introspective sense, right? It seems to me that you're in pain because it seems to me that you're holding your jaw while crying, and I have lots of beliefs about, implicit beliefs about that meaning that you're in pain.
But do you agree that in principle, it could, so you can imagine, here's a possible world. The possible world is where people have these introspective capacities for other people's states. So maybe they don't even have them about themselves. So when it seems to me that you're in pain, it seems to me that I have special access to a state of yours, which has these, subjective properties, phenomenal feel, all the stuff that you think is problematic. And so it just seems like I have direct access. And it's in your mind over there. I don't say it's in my mind. I'm in something similar that resembles it. I just sort of mischaracterize your behavior as giving me special access to one of your mental states. That's at least conceivable, right? On your view, that this could turn out that way. I mean,
but actually, so it's not something that I had thought a lot about it, but actually, given the answers that I gave you earlier, it seems to me that no, it should not be conceivable. Because if I think that if I'm in a situation where I introspect that you are in pain, and it appears to me that you are in pain, then given the way in which my concept of appearance are intertwined with my concept of phenomenal state, then it should implicitly mean that I judge that if it appears to me that you are in pain, that I judge implicitly that I'm in a state that resembles your pain. And so it needs to be the case that I'm in pain. In some sort of state that resembles pain.
Right. Okay. But I see what you're saying.
So it seems to me that one consequence of my view is that I cannot introspect someone else's pain or someone else's phenomenal mental states without at the same time being myself in some sort of state that resembles it. And as for the thing, but then you should be able to know infallibly, or you should have the intuition that you should be able to know infallibly my own pain or the pain of someone else.
Right.
I don't see it because, in my view, the intuition that we have some sort of infallible appearance of our own phenomenal mental states derives in some sort of byproduct of this resemblance rule, right? So the reason why my own pain appears to me when I have it is because when I'm in this phenomenal state resembles itself, and in virtue of resembles itself, it makes itself appear to me, right? But then if you are in pain, there is no reason to think that necessarily it should appear to me, because it's a subject within the state resembling something that has the appearance of this something.
Right.
So, I think we're getting.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, so I mean, I have more things I could ask about this, but let's move on because I see I can't keep you forever, and it's already getting late here. So I want to go back to this question about introspection because it came up in the chat. I don't know if you've been keeping an eye on the chat or not, but it came up in the chat, and it's something that I've always wondered about too. So, and that's the extent.
Okay, I didn't know
that you don't have to worry about it. But so this is a question that was asked by T-Jump, who's in the chat, but also one that I've asked a lot in the past, which is how can we move past the idea that this is merely a verbal dispute? So you say phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist, and then you give this story about introspection, and then the answer would be, well, that's what consciousness is, right? It's, so anyway, yeah. How what is it that's why I know. Well, I already know what you're going to say, but why aren't you giving a theory of consciousness that's realist, but just minus some of the baggage, as opposed to saying the thing isn't really there? I think that's the core of the question.
Okay. So I think we are to a certain extent back to the distinction between strong illusionism and weak illusionism, and really in the end, my ways of approaching it is really this. I think first we have to start with whether we make it a verbal dispute or not. So is it a problem about what we decide to call consciousness or phenomenal consciousness, or is it more than that?
Right.
So let's say for 1 second that it is more than that. My way of making sense of what it could be to be more than that is to say, well, we have a grasp introspectively of what we mean by phenomenal consciousness, and we agree on that. And then we debate on whether this is physical or whether, in fact, this is not physical but exists, or maybe as I say and Keith say, this does not exist. And if we say that, then what my worry with weak illusionists is that what they are saying is that this exists, this is physical, even though indeed we agree. I mean, I think most of them agree that we have a lot of trouble seeing how it could be physical exactly. At least it's not obvious, and we have a hard problem and the explanatory gap. Mm-hmm. And then I think my worry is that in that point I agree with Dave Chalmers, which is that in that case weak illusionism does not really advances with the hard problem. We are still wondering, how can this be physical? Like, we admit that it is physical because we have decided that it is, but then how can it be? And then we face something that for me is like a mystery. Then the other view is, or Keith also would say, the problem is that we have no conception of this that would be more substantive than, let's say, just a physical stuff. Because of course the weak illusionists in that case want to say that it is a substantive claim to say that this is physical and this is such and such brain state. So it has to be more substantive than any physical description, and at the same time not too substantive that it does not have the baggage. And I'm not sure I see what this diet qualia thing is. Right. That's we are putting it. So that was one branch of the tree, seeing it as a substantive issue, weak illusionism versus strong illusionism. And if we see it that way, for me, weak illusionism is either committed to some sort of mysteries that I cannot accept, or and also does not help us with a hard problem. Now, if we say, now it's just a verbal issue. And I think sometimes I had discussion with David Papineau, for example. I remember David Papineau, he was in my dissertation committee, and we had a little debate about that. And at some point, so of course, I don't want him to be committed to whatever I'm going to say, but I think he said something like, yeah, you know what, François, we agree about what exists. In the end, I agree with strong illusionists that that's really what exists, and there is nothing over or above that. And I also agree that through introspection, maybe it seems to us that there is more, at least, or maybe through introspection, aided in a certain way. At least he agrees that quite robustly something else seems to be there that is not there. And then the question becomes, what do we decide to call consciousness? Should we call consciousness this thing that introspectively kind of appears to be here and is not really here, or whatever is really here and, let's say, tends to make us judge that there's something more or whatever. And then the issue becomes verbal, and then the way you should settle it is by thinking about what kind of rhetorical advantage you get from here. And at this point, let's describe the situation as follows. Some people, and I think there are many of them, I think David Papineau is one of them. I think Michael Graziano is also one of them. Yeah. They just don't want to say that they are illusionists, because they know that as soon as they say, well, consciousness, at least in some important sense, does not exist, you're going to have half the room leaving and saying that this is crazy, right? And so they don't want to say it. So they choose to call consciousness something else. My view is that when we do that, we have many things that we lose. First, I think we lose clarity, because the way, at least maybe not consciousness in general, but at least phenomenal consciousness, the way this term has been introduced as a technical term for, I think, a few decades now, what philosophers have been discussed about, it is something that we grasp through introspection, right? It's not whatever causes it, it's this. So I think it is clearer and it is more respectful of previous use to just keep on using phenomenal consciousness for this. The second thing that we lose is that I think if we illusionists, we back down to this like this realist rage like the thing that you're just silly, or you're just stupid, or you're just crazy, or you're just a monster, whatever. And the problem is that we'll back down for bad reasons, because my impression is that the very thing that makes us believe that consciousness of all things has to exist and cannot be an illusion is precisely this aspect of consciousness that we cannot accept. So even if you're a weak illusionist, that's like the certainty or the impossible to deny, that's precisely something that you want to get rid of, right? If you're a weak illusionist, you don't think that consciousness is any kind of thing that you have some sort of special access to. You think it's just one more phenomenon in the brain, and we can very well be wrong about it, and etc. Right? So I think it's wrong to back down to the realist rage, because we back down for bad reasons, because we implicitly give up something that we should crucially deny. Right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
That's my view of the debate. And of course, we can still be at a stage where, like with David Papineau and others, in fact, we agree about maybe most of the facts. But then the question is, how are we going to be understood, and how is it going to fit into the further debate? And for me, strong illusionism is clearer, it's more respectful of previous views, and it does not lead to this implicit or suggestion that we, in fact, accept a phenomenal epistemology that we don't want to accept and we should not accept. That's related to my previous story about the weak illusionist, right?
Exactly, right.
About the tension between the reasons, like the motivation for really staying just a weak illusionist and accepting the existence of consciousness, and the fact that if you're really a weak illusionist who also wants to be a coherent physicalist, you probably have to accept a phenomenal epistemology that is pretty weak and open to a lot of errors and mistakes and illusions, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, okay. So let me segue into talking about the normative problem, because that's something I think which maybe some of the things that you're just saying right now are in tension with. And I highly recommend this paper. I think this paper, it's coming on Ergo, right? I think on the normative problem is just one of the best things that's been written on illusionism probably ever. So I highly recommend that people read it, because it's honest, it's probing, it's thorough, it's clear, it's accessible. I love everything about it. So, and not that I'm not that the other papers weren't as well, but this one I think especially for me really crystallized some things that I was thinking about. And this came up in the chat as well, because people were asking about Jeff Lee's alien subjectivity, and so that's, you know, I think are you familiar with Jeff's work?
So I read a few papers of his, precisely I think for writing the paper on the normative challenge for illusionist views of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And but maybe you can remind me of the relevant part of Jeff Lee's work, so that I can maybe... Well,
I think what he wants to do is challenge what you call phenomenal value, and maybe even exclusive phenomenal value, or I think just maybe even generally like phenomenal value. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I had him on the show and talked to him, and I read his book on this and everything. Anyway, so the basic idea is that, you know, we have this strong intuition, as you point out, that connects, you know, more morally relevant properties with phenomenal consciousness. And so the illusionist is at least under, it looks like they have to give up something that we don't want to give up. And on your own preferred view, I take it that you have to accept that things like pains just aren't as bad as we thought that they were. Yeah. That because they would be worse if they had this phenomenal aspect, but you deny that it's there, so that what we think is the really bad part of pain isn't as bad as we think that it is, which is, I mean, it's obviously compatible with the view and everything you're saying, but it's really hard to stomach. It's a cost of the view, I would say, to put it mildly.
No, I agree. So, yeah, so the way I see things is we have, this strong intuition that there is some sort of connection between phenomenality and value. And I tried in the paper to spell it out under the form of two different theses. One view would be, well, there are lots of the standard phenomenal properties that are such that when they are instantiated, they ground some sort of intrinsic value. And typically it would be like pleasure and pain, and also maybe lots of others, but at least those. And then some people would go further and they would say, no, it's not just that when these properties are instantiated, they ground some value, but also only properties that are phenomenal can do that, right? And so that if there is no consciousness, nothing has value.
Right.
And so what I try to say is that these two theses, I think, are attractive to a point. The first one, I find it very intuitively attractive. And the second one, I'm not sure. My own intuition is not clear if I'm not sure. But anyway, I think it also has some attraction. And then what I say is that, well, if you're an illusionist, that like accepting one or two of these theses might prove uncomfortable. Because basically, if you accept the second one, that means that you're a nihilist, right? Illusionism leads to nihilism. And many people find it uncomfortable. Some people can live with it. Many people find it uncomfortable. Even if you accept just the first one, which basically would mean, well, there is some value that is grounded entirely by non-phenomenal stuff. Maybe, for example, there is some value grounded by purely non-phenomenal objective beauty or objective knowledge or correct representations or complexity, whatever. There is some value grounded by some non-phenomenal stuff. But at the same time, when, for example, someone is in phenomenal pain, this in itself grounds some negative value in that case. And what I'm saying is that, well, so you have these intuitive views, and the illusionist must choose whether to accept or to deny it. And even, for example, if the illusionist just accept the weaker one, just the phenomenal value, like, yes, for example, pleasure and pain, they ground some value. If you accept that and you're an illusionist, it has some normative revisionary consequences. Because as you said, it means that, well, maybe after all, pain in the real world is not phenomenal. So it does not have this extra awful feely aspects that I thought it had, and maybe it's not as bad. It involves that it's not as bad, right? If this extra feely awful stuff was grounding some value, or would have been grounding some value, and it's not there, then it's not as bad. It can still be bad for lots of other reasons,
right?
Because there might be other things in quasi-phenomenal pain that ground some negative values. Maybe, for example, quasi-phenomenal pain is a frustration of one of my desires, and it's bad to frustrate some of my desires. Maybe quasi-phenomenal pain is something that I dislike, and it's bad to be something that I dislike. So you have ways around it. But in the end, you have to accept that, yes, if this ingredient is not there in the world, and if you believe that this ingredient would ground some value, so contrary to what you thought earlier, the distribution of value has to be a bit different.
Right.
So what I do in the paper is really I try to map the options, because I don't have a very clear idea of where I want to stand, but I also think that it's a real issue for illusionists, and I think they should not try to avoid it.
Right. So what you're just talking about is what you call the moderate position, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The moderate position would be to say, intuitively, I can accept that there is some value grounded outside of phenomenality that does not require phenomenality. Maybe, for example, some set of like purely objective, non-phenomenal knowledge or correct representations or things of that kind. But it would still be the case that if someone had this phenomenal, glowy pleasure or pain, this would ground some negative or positive value. And it does not happen in the real world, contrary to what most people used to think. So we have some revisions to make. I think a good way to approach it intuitively, what I think my preferred position is to think about other examples outside of phenomenality. For example, this example came to me a few days ago. Think about what people were believing in the late Middle Age when it comes to political legitimacy. In Europe, they had this theory of the divine rights of kings. They thought that the kings, not only the king of France, but I don't think he was the only one, they thought that the kings were in some sense ruling the country because they had been chosen by God. So they had some divine right to lead. They were the lieutenant of God. And let's say you are in this society and you believe that, and you think that the king is super legitimate, right? There's a maximum legitimacy, like God, right? And then let's say you come to stop believing in that, either because you abandon the theories of the divine right of king, or you think that God does not exist, or that God does not choose a king. And so in some sense, does that mean that there is no legitimate government anymore? No, maybe you can have another theory of legitimacy, like a democratic theory or whatever. But does that still mean that whatever person governed the country is still not as legitimate as you thought the king was when you thought the king had the divine right? Yes, because it's very hard to beat God. It's true that if the king had this divine right of God, it would be really super legitimate. Like, you know,
yeah, exactly.
My view of consciousness is a bit the same. I think we have this strong a priori connection between some phenomenal states and their phenomenal properties and intrinsic value. And once we admit that there are no phenomenal states, maybe we have to admit also that, yeah, there is some sort of glowy awfulness or maybe glowy greatness that is not really there in the world. And so maybe we can still admit that some things are good or bad, but maybe it will not be distributed exactly in the same way. And for example, maybe one thing that I think we would have to do is to weaken the contrast that we make between sentient creatures and non-sentient creatures. I think this is a very intuitive contrast for most people, including for myself. I find it super intuitive that really, if you're sentient, you have rights and you have dignity and you have something. And if you're not sentient, then no, and there is a strong border. But if I'm an illusionist, I think it's very hard to make sense of that in an illusionist framework. I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's very hard and it ends up looking artificial and a bit arbitrary. Right. And so I think it does not mean that you can make people suffer. No, it does not mean that. But it probably means that you cannot keep this stark contrast and you have to revise that. Because whatever you think will play the role of grounding value, it would be very arbitrary and artificial if it worked exactly like phenomenal consciousness used to. So it would have to work differently. Its borders would be different, and you would end up with a different distribution of value.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I think this relates to the question. Let's see, who was it that asked this in the chat? I think it's Daniel Capel. So because the reason I think he brought up Jeff's view, because Jeff takes the kind of very strong line that there are states which are not conscious, but that matter as much. So that's the alien subjectivity. So if there were non-conscious aliens, they would have states that played certain roles, and those states would matter for them as much as like consciousness matters for us. So I think that he thinks we are phenomenally conscious. Jeff is that is, but that the aliens who lacked consciousness would have states that mattered as much as our real phenomenal consciousness state. So I don't think he's an illusionist, but it sounds like I hear you denying that. I think that you think that if there were really phenomenally conscious states, they would matter a little bit more than states which lacked it. Is that correct? Or
so yeah, I think at this stage now, because really it's again the paper I wrote is really more about mapping options that we're defending one. So I'm inclined to think that, but I'm ready to change my mind at this stage. I would say it's a little bit like, again, like I think the European king's divine right is a good example. Like, yeah, I think if there was some divine rights of kings, then that would be super legitimate. No question.
Right. So you don't think another way of being legitimate would be just as good as being chosen by God if there were a God and all that stuff?
Well, because the problem is that because I'm an illusionist, I think that whatever quasi-phenomenal consciousness is, it's something that realists agree that we have. Right. So whatever I think in quasi-phenomenal consciousness grounds value, I think it's probably the case that if I was, so there are probably some ways around if you have a conditional theory, but in the first place, it's probably the case that if I was a consciousness realist, I would agree that I still have this quasi-phenomenal stuff. Right.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that that's the difference between, I think, Geoffrey's conception, because he's not an illusionist, right? So he thinks that these aliens and us, we really have different things. It's not that they have something more or have something more and also what they are. It's like we have a different set of things. But if we are an illusionist, we think that we have something less compared to what the phenomenal realist says we have. At least most phenomenal realists, because again, it's in reality.
Yeah. So I mean, Jeff thinks that, zombies, their pains matter, or pain stars, or whatever you want to call them, that they're in certain states that play a certain role, and that they can be in. So the zombie world, and I know you bring this up in your paper, like the zombie suffering kind of cases and things like that. Jeff seems to think that the zombie pains matter as much as our pains. There's no difference between them, except that ours are really conscious and theirs are not. Yeah. So in that sense, they do have something that's less than ours.
Yeah, but it's not.
But he thinks they matter exactly the same. Yeah. So that's like what I hear you denying.
Yeah. No, I understand. So they have something less. It's just a possible thing, but it's not normatively significant. They matter as much as we do. I think the problem with such view, I think it's coherent. The problem with such view, which I think would be what most illusionists, at least, are not that many illusionists, but I think, for example, Keith, I think he would like to go that way. The problem for me with such view is that we still have to deal with a strong intuition that the zombie, when they suffer, it might be bad, but it's not as bad. Right. And so I think almost everyone has this intuition. And so if you have this intuition, then you have either to accept the intuition, saying, yeah, it says something true about the connection between phenomenality and value. Just phenomenality is not real in our world, so we have to deal with it. Or you say, no, I reject the intuition. And then what I try to do in the paper is see what would be the ways of rejecting the intuition. And it's not clear that they are that easy to reject.
Right.
Because even if you believe that zombies are not possible, or even if you believe that they are possible and actual and that it's conscious creatures who are not possible, the idea is that our intuitions about value, anyway, they are probably things that we can have about like merely conceivable worlds, right? I can just conceive something and then elicit some sort of intuition of value about that. And if we start saying that we cannot do that, let's say it is not that easy as it seems, right? It's something that we do all the time to evaluate how valuable a situation would be, even though we have no guarantees that it is more than just conceivable. We have no guarantees that it's possible. We do that all the time.
Right.
And so anyway, maybe I'm being a bit too fast here, but so what I mean is that my worry with answers that I agree would be quite natural and quite attractive, which would be to say, well, actually zombies' pain is just as bad as ours, is that we still have to deal with this pretty strong intuition that there is a difference between the normative significance of a zombie pain and the pain of a conscious creature.
Right.
And how to deal with that, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, so I do share the intuition that, you know, it would be bad to kill zombies, but not as bad. So I agree with you, I think, more than I would with Jeff, but it's not as bad as, you know, killing you or I, or being that was really phenomenally conscious. And you can kind of imagine like trolley cases. So if you had, you know, one person on one side of the track that was the illusionist theory of consciousness was true, and the other side that the phenomenal realist theory was true, I think it would be worse to kill that person than the other one. Although both bad, obviously, it's like the 1 versus 5, both are bad options. So that's the way I tend to think. I do think that having phenomenal consciousness adds some value. But I think the way that these, you know, that way people like Jeff think is that, well, that's just kind of a byproduct of the fact that we can't really imaginatively put ourselves into their position, because we're sort of that we're locked into a certain way of being, such that we can't make sense of them from our point of view, so that there's maybe a bit of a bias or something here, which you know, you can work your way around. But yeah, I don't know. So do you agree about the trolley case though, that if you had to pick, it would be like better to kill the illusionist? I mean, not the illusionist theorist, but the one of which the illusion theory was true versus the phenomenal realist.
Yeah. So I have to imagine a possible world in which there is phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. And then there is one zombie, like there is one zombie and one non-zombie. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's tricky because, of course, from my point of view, because we are all zombies, what you're asking me to imagine is something like one is a normal human being and the other is some sort of human being with some sort of extra glowy angel stuff that I used to think I had, but I don't. And that's tricky because, of course, I like the human, right? I don't want to say kill the human, but what I can say that I definitely feel the pull of saying, yes, there is maybe something extra in this like glowy angel stuff. So maybe I think we should choose that creature. The same way you should tell me, is a possible world where there is really a real divine king, right? A divinely chosen king. Should you serve the king or serve the will of the democratically elected, like the will of the people? And then I want to say, well, in our world, the best thing is democracy. So normally I would say the democratically elected guy, right? But if it's really a world with a really elected, really divinely chosen king, I suppose I have to go with him.
That's interesting because I don't share that. I would say still it's better to go with the people. I don't see, even if there were a God.
Really God. Like it's really God, like in the definition, like omniscient, omnipotent, ultra benevolent. If it's really God, as in the definition, that's the difficulty because I don't think there is such a thing. But
right, me neither.
As in the definition, I think you have to go with it, no?
Huh? Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would disagree with that, but I see what you're saying. I mean, I take the point that that gives something extra. But so to what extent do you think illusionists can ground morality? So do you think like could you be a utilitarian and still, I mean, not like a preference utilitarian, but like an old school, like hedonism utilitarian,
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like pain and pleasure, like Bentham and those kinds of bias. Does that kind of view make sense on illusionism?
So my impression is that I think it's always possible to develop it if you really want to, because what you can always say is that, well, look, we thought that we had to maximize well-being, and that well-being was a matter of having certain phenomenal states. And no, we have to say that it's a matter of having certain quasi-phenomenal states. And that's it. Now, there are two problems with such a story. The first problem is that there is something attractive and intuitive about, let's say, hedonism, utilitarian hedonism, like the standard one that you were describing, which is that we seem to be pretty sure that pain is bad and pleasure is good. And one of the reasons why we seem to be pretty sure of that is that, so to speak, they wear their quality on their sleeves. I think it's some Seeger say something there at some point. Like we see immediately that it's good or bad. Like we just have to imagine what it is and say, yeah, that's good, that's bad. No doubt about that. I can doubt about lots of things from a moral point of view, but not the value of pain and pleasure. But if you are an illusionist and you think there is no such thing as this like glowy, revealed pain and pleasure, there is just some functional quasi-phenomenal stuff, then it's not as clear that you can justify it as well, right?
Right.
Because your standard justification will, you will have a hard time making it work. I'm not saying there is not some way around. Maybe you can still say, well, introspection is reliable for some things, not for others. Maybe it's reliable for value, but not for like metaphysical nature of the state thought about. But then there is, I describe this debate in my paper. I think one problem is that it's not clear that we know about the badness and of pain and the goodness of pleasure or similar things by introspection, strictly speaking. I think we know about it much more in some sort of a priori process. What we know by introspection is that we feel this, but that this is bad or this is good. It's not clear that we know it through introspection. Right. So it's not clear that you can easily salvage some sort of good moral epistemology of pain and pleasure in an illusionist framework. So that's one problem. The second problem is that whatever theory you give of what makes quasi-phenomenal pain and pleasure good or bad, you will have to explain what aspects of it makes it good and bad. And then it's very likely that in order, like whatever theory you develop, it's very likely that it will either be elegant and then it will probably be extended beyond the realm of creatures we usually think are sentient, or it will be very inelegant and super botched. Like, I don't have a proof of that, but I think that if you have to give like some sort of functional feature of quasi-phenomenal pain and pleasure that grounds its badness and its goodness, and then think about what has it in the world, I think it's very unlikely that we'll have a theory that is both elegant and coherent, and also does not sometimes weaken the contrast between sentient and non-sentient creatures, right? Because you would say something like, well, maybe it's because we dislike, in some sort of purely functional sense, of course, we dislike the pain, but then probably in some sort of functional sense, we also dislike the unconscious, like the purely unconscious pain, or non-sentient creatures also probably in some sort of functional sense dislike their purely functional pain. So what I mean is that you can probably be like standard hedonist utilitarist if you're an illusionist, but then you have one problem which is justifying your view, and one other problem which is accounting for the badness or the goodness of the state you think about without changing too much the distribution of this goodness and goodness. And you might probably end up doing it if you're coherent and if you want a theory that is elegant enough. So yeah, that's one of the things I think is the case. If you want to know sorry,
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say as for my own preference, because again, that's more a paper where I try to map the option, because I think that's not something that has been discussed so far. I hope some more people will also like take that and build on this. That would be my hope. But my own preferred option, I must say, I think I'm inclined towards a view where there's some sort of non-utilitarian view. I think I'm inclined to
like a deontological view or something.
No, not theological. I think I'm inclined towards consequentialism. I think I like consequentialism. I
see. Okay.
But some sort of non-utilitarian. I mean, it depends how you define utilitarian.
No, I understand.
Something that deeply appeals to well-being. I think deep down, but that's weird. I think I really like the good old Platonician conception of ethics. So I think in the end, what is good is contemplate and love the good, and you have to make sense of that at some point with what we have, right? I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just telling you.
No, it does, yeah.
What I'm inclined to follow, and that makes a very Platonician framework, because we live in the cave, right? It's all an illusion, and we have to love and contemplate the good And so maybe quasi-phenomenal pleasure and pain have something to do with it, but it's not central to what it is.
I see. So I have two questions that I want to ask really quickly. So one is do you think, in your own personal view, is illusionism true of animals, non-human animals, by which I mean dogs, sheep, cows, or
what you mean by that is that also the case that they are not phenomenally conscious, or is that the case that they have an illusion of consciousness?
Yeah, that they have the illusion of consciousness.
So I'm inclined, I don't have a strong view on that. I think I'm inclined to say no, because I'm inclined to think that they don't have the sort of meta cognitive introspective capacities that would allow for them to judge, like to be such that it appears to them that they are phenomenally conscious.
Okay. So that does like that would be a big revision if you're a hedonistic utilitarian, right? You can't say like what Bentham said about, it's whether they feel, not whether they think or something.
Yeah, but it depends, because of course you can still say, well, they don't have the illusion of consciousness, but they can still have quasi-phenomenal consciousness. If you define quasi-phenomenal consciousness as, for example, whatever natural kind tends in us reliably to cause the illusion of consciousness. So dogs could be quasi-conscious in a way
just like us, but without the introspection.
Yeah, but they don't have the illusion.
Right.
But they are still quasi-conscious. So in that respect, my impression is that if illusionism has to have some sort of revisionary normative consequence with the way we treat animals, it's not so much that it will make the animals that don't have the illusion of consciousness irrelevant or less valuable. I don't see it, but I do think that there is some things about the sentient, non-sentient distinction that probably has to go. I don't see how it could keep being the case. It has to go, and in the end, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, probably it has to go. And I'm pretty convinced that it will go, by the way. I think this distinction, I like the distinction if it forces us to pay attention to other creatures than human, right?
Right.
In that sense, it's a useful distinction. But while you focus on the border, is it really sentient or really not sentient? I think illusionism gives us reason to think that we should not pay attention too much to that. It's not there is no really, because when it comes to quasi-phenomenal consciousness, there would not be any important distinction. Right? You need to believe in phenomenal consciousness to think that's really different to be sentient or not sentient.
So like questions about like, are trees conscious, sentient, are going to be like for you sort of cases of like, we can't really answer those kinds of questions in a real way.
What about lobsters? What about oysters?
Yeah.
I think I want to say, well, no one is phenomenally conscious anyway. And when it comes to quasi-phenomenal consciousness, well, it's some sort of functional stuff and it will be more or less similar. And in the end, we have to decide what is valuable without, because, just digression, I'm digressing. Sometimes I feel like in the debate about what is valuable when it comes to other creatures, animals, consciousness is just used as some sort of black box. We say, well, we don't know, but if they are conscious, then that's important. And if they are not, well, that's okay. But in the end, I think we have to admit that there is no such magical properties that could, in fact, settle the matter. And we have to decide, anyway, are they valuable or not for what they are, right? And not for some internal extra properties that they would maybe or maybe not possess. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. And then one other thing was, how do you respond to Chalmers' master argument against illusionism, where he says, if illusionism is true, no one's ever had a phenomenal pain, but people have had phenomenal pains, therefore no illusionism. You just think that begs the question, or what do you think about that?
So I wrote a paper about that, actually. It's a draft. It's somewhere under review. I also sent to Dave, right? So it's I hope it will be out at some point. But what I want to say is that, first, I want to say, yes, I accept that illusionism involves that in at least one important sense of pain, then it implies that we are not in pain. So I accept the entailment. I don't think it's a good idea to just wiggle around and try to deny it. I think it's just clearer to accept it.
Okay.
So in some sense of pain, illusionism means that no one has ever felt pain. And then I would just deny that people sometimes feel pain. And so Chalmers would say, but it's obviously true. And then I would say, so that's the gist of the paper that is under review. Right? And then I would say, lots of obviously true claims have been at least, are not considered false. Right? We have found arguments like that made us consider that these claims that seemed obviously true are in fact false. And I think that illusionism can do good illusionist argument can provide the same thing, except if you say that there is something super duper special about the obviousness of consciousness rather than the other kind of obviousness, right? And that's what you have to say. You have to say there is something super duper obvious. And then my strategy is to try to say, well, what is your evidence for that the existence of phenomenal consciousness is super duper obvious?
Right.
And then I think
back to the beginning, all through the whole thing over again.
Because I think at this point, I think the best answer of someone like Chalmers is to say, well, this itself is obvious. And then you can do the same thing. Oh, yeah, but you can have argument against that. So you need to say the super duper obviousness is also super duper obvious. And basically what I say is that at some point you have to break down, because at some point it cannot be super duper obvious. It cannot be obvious at all, because at some point it just becomes highly theoretical.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. And I would like to read this paper. If maybe I'll send you an email.
I'm sending you the draft, right? It's under review. I never know what is a policy regarding preprint online that are under review. Should I do it? Should I not do it? In the past, I was doing it. I'm not doing it right now, but actually I'm a bit annoyed because this paper has been under review for a long time. And
that's super. I know. I think you should put it up, although lazy reviewers will Google the title and try to find out who wrote it. Obviously, that's a problem. But yeah, I know. I have the same issue. I go back and forth in the same exact way over this exact.
Okay,
same
I think I might
have a paper that's been in review for 1.5 years right now. It's been revised. It's still in review, but it's like I would like to share it. You know, it's like, but yeah. So I know exactly how you feel. I hearing screaming from downstairs, which means the kids are driving my wife crazy. So I do have to wrap this up. But we didn't even get to talk about phenomenological overflow, which is I was really that paper I'm so excited about. So maybe if you have the time and patience, I'll have you back on and we could talk about that, because that's something that's dear to my heart there, that whole issue. And you have some really interesting, you contributed to it, some really interesting, and I think important results about this debate.
Yes.
But besides overflow, was there anything that you were hoping would come up that hasn't come up?
Let me think. No, I think we covered the ground. Yeah, we could have talked about overflow, but obviously we have talked more than 2 hours 20. So I think
yeah, exactly.
We're both tired. We'll talk about that another day. I would be glad to do it.
Yeah, and also self-building technologies. I read your paper on that. So I mean, there's a lot of interesting ideas that you have that I would like to talk to you more
some
about.
Peripheral stuff. Yeah, the thing on overflow, I like it because I think it's an intervention in the debate that I and with 2 other co-authors we did, and none of us are really expert of these precise debates, because the debate on overflow is a huge debate, right? Tons of people like you have contributed, lots of people have contributed, and it becomes almost some sort of subfield.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we had this paper with an experimental part that we did. So Florian Kova and Maxence Gaillard. And what I liked is that none of us were really expert, but I think what we did is pretty interesting. Coming a little bit as outsiders, and I think doing something that should have been done for at least 10 years in my opinion.
You know, just anecdotally, I was trying to get people to do that behind the scenes every experimental philosopher I know, I was like, do this. And, you know, anyway, so no one did. So when your paper came out, I was like, finally, someone this is like needed to be done. Like, you know, don't just anecdotally say, people say this, like, let's find out. So let's actually look at what they say and get some qualitative data besides the quantitative data.
Yeah. Maybe just some of the gist of the study for the viewers. So there is this overflow argument, and the overflow argument notably relies on the idea that, well, you have lots of ways to account for like Sperling's experiment and Landman's experiment and all these experiments, but in the end, we should choose the overflow interpretation because it fits better with what the subjects themselves say about the experiment. Because the subjects in all these experiments, they say that, yes, they have perceived everything. They have perceived much more than they could report. That's what they say. And now we decided, is it really what they say? And then when we look about what the references are for this claim, they are really sparse. It's just a few anecdotal claims or some super old studies.
Yeah, it's one offhand comment by Sperling, actually. That's it.
And then what we did is that we replicated like the Sperling experiment with the letters and Landman's experiment with the rectangles. And then we asked the subjects, so what did you feel like you just saw? And turns out it's not clear at all that they support overflow. Like it's
exactly.
Like you can maybe save it, but really if you have to say something is supported by the subject report, it's much more some sort of mix of sparse fragmentary phenomenology and generic phenomenology, and maybe probably both of them. So it's not claiming that that's what is right, because anyway, in the end, I don't think there is phenomenology. But if you are interested in subjective data,
yeah,
does not support what people claim it support. And I think it's important because we have to do more of this like careful study of like introspective report, subjective data, and this kind of things.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more, actually. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for coming on, François. And also recommend your work. I mean, your philosophy is like the best in philosophy as I think of it. It's challenging, but clear. It's honest. It doesn't back down from hard problems. Comes up with creative and interesting solutions that really challenge you in the best possible way, which is what good philosophy is supposed to do. It's supposed to take something that you thought there's no way you could challenge this, and then you say, well, here's an argument, and you go, oh, makes you anyway. So I highly recommend your work. I thank you for it and for your time. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah,
stay on for just a second. I'll say bye off the air, by the way. But
okay. So thank you for your nice words. Thank you for having me here. It was really a pleasure having this 2 hours 20 conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And maybe another time also.
Okay. Yeah, they're all saying thank you and bye too. All right. So I'm going to click the button and we will be off the air. All right. We're off the air now. So it's not